In the history of warfare, some campaigns are remembered as glorious demonstrations of the profession of arms. But there are other chapters of military history that arouse far less passion and enthusiasm. One example dates from the later years of the Second World War. Between 1943 and 1945, the Allies fought an offensive campaign that became one of the least remembered episodes of the conflict. The campaign in Italy. In the end, it was a successful campaign. The Allied forces were victorious. But success in Italy took time. 20 long months of fighting were required before Italy was fully in Allied hands. It was a campaign that saw some of the bloodiest exchanges of the whole war, often in the harshest of battle conditions. The weather and the landscape made the Italian campaign a miserable experience for the individual soldier. For the Allied troops, there was also the suspicion of poor decision-making by some of their commanders. On a number of crucial occasions, senior officers gave orders that can now be seen as dubious, if not worse. The names of Italian battlefields like Anzio and Monte Cassino are not associated with brilliant Allied decision-making. The deployment of American bombers against the Cassino monastery remains one of the most controversial operations of the Second World War. By the time the Italian campaign neared its end, many exhausted Allied troops wondered if the whole enterprise had been little more than a sideshow to more dramatic events in other theatres of operation. But warfare is not always about dash and brilliance, and solid, slow-moving campaigns can deliver real strategic value. In the course of the battle for Italy, the Allies succeeded in tying down hundreds of thousands of German troops that could have fought elsewhere. And there were occasions when commanders of both sides revealed a military skill to match the bravery of the men under their command. There is still much to be remembered about the battlefield of Italy. In January 1943, the British Prime Minister and the President of the United States met to discuss the progress of the Second World War. At the Casablanca Conference, Winston Churchill and Franklin D. Roosevelt could reflect on the changing fortunes of the fight against the Axis powers. In the North African lands to the east of Casablanca, the Allies were well on their way to driving the Germans and Italians out of the region for good. The British-led First Army stood on a front line in Tunisia, waiting for the right moment to strike east against the ports of Tunis and Bizerta. At the same time, the Eighth Army of General Montgomery continued its pursuit of Rommel's Panzerarmee that began in the aftermath of El Alamein. On the Eastern Front, the fortunes of the Allies were also beginning to change by January 1943. At Stalingrad, the Soviet Union stood poised on the edge of victory in one of the bloodiest and most significant battles in history. Far away in the Pacific, the Japanese were preparing to withdraw from the island of Guadalcanal after months of bitter jungle fighting. The age of unchecked Japanese expansion was over, and the war situation was very different to that of 12 months before. There was no doubt that on 3 separate fronts, the tide of the war was turning. The question that faced the Allied leadership was simple: where next to strike against Hitler and the Axis enemy? As preparations continued for the Normandy landings of 1944, it was decided that Allied forces would launch an additional strike against the home soil of Hitler's greatest ally, the Italian dictator Benito Mussolini. When victory in North Africa was secured on May 13, 1943, preparations were already well advanced for an invasion of Sicily. If the Allies could make a successful leap across from North Africa and capture the island, the door to the Italian mainland itself would be open. To lead the operation, the regional command appointed two heroes of the African fighting. Dwight Eisenhower and his British deputy Harold Alexander decided that the invasion of Sicily required the deployment of two Allied armies: the American 7th Army of General George S. Patton and the legendary British 8th Army, the Desert Rats of Bernard Montgomery. The operation was given the code name Husky, and D-Day was set for the evening of the 9th and the 10th of July 1943. Eisenhower and Alexander knew that their invasion force was experienced and well equipped. Together, the two Allied armies could muster a total of 180,000 men. But they also knew that the Sicily offensive would face stiff opposition. The island was home to over 300,000 Italian troops. It was also the base for some 40,000 Germans, including the men of the elite Hermann Göring Panzer Division. There is no doubt that the Allied command was concerned about facing German troops like these. But when it came to their Italian colleagues, there was real doubt about their stomach for continuing the war. The fighting in North Africa had done nothing for the reputation of the Italian fighting man. In Western eyes, Mussolini's forces were more famous for their mass surrenders than their effectiveness in combat. Patton and Montgomery could not know for sure what kind of response there would be as their men made ready for action. But they did know that they'd already pulled off one of the most imaginative deceptions of the Second World War. In May, the body of an Allied serviceman was found washed up on the Spanish coast. The dead man was carrying secret documents, giving details of the next Allied assault against the island of Sardinia, not Sicily. Spain was supposedly neutral, but Franco's sympathies with the Axis powers meant that the secret documents soon found their way to German eyes. The nature of the find meant that the information was believed by German intelligence. When the Allies attacked Sicily, the Germans believed that it was only a decoy offensive. They were soon proved wrong. For the Allies, the invasion of Sicily represented the first attempt to engage the enemy on his home ground, and the officers in charge felt confident of success. But Operation Husky was not as straightforward as the Allied command would have liked, and the fighting that took place gave a hint of the type of campaign that lay ahead in Italy. The Sicilian offensive was arranged as a joint operation, beginning with simultaneous amphibious and airborne landings to the south of the island. On the evening of the 9th, Allied paratroop carriers and glider pullers took to the skies to drop a total of 4,000 men. But the result was a near disaster. Poor navigation meant that 70 British gliders were forced to land in the sea, and 200 men were lost as a result. It was a worrying start to Operation Husky. The battle for Sicily began in earnest just minutes after the Allied landings. As expected, it was German forces who resisted hardest. Many American paratroopers came under fire before they hit the ground. But despite the problems with the airborne landings, the amphibious element of Operation Husky proved a success. Within 24 hours, the Americans and British established a tentative beachhead along 85 miles of Sicilian coastline. Six days into the operation, the Anglo-American landing force was securely established along the South Sicilian coast. Back in Rome, the Italian leader's hold on power was beginning to slip away. With the Sicilian landings achieved, the Allied task was now to advance north, to secure the ports of Palermo and Messina and open the way to the Italian mainland. Montgomery's 8th Army were allocated to the sector at the east of the island, in the direction of Mount Etna. Patton's 7th were ordered to sweep around to the west before heading towards Messina along Sicily's northern coast. It was not an easy enterprise. On July the 13th, a detachment of British commandos found itself involved in a fierce battle for possession of the Ponte di Bellati bridge. It was clear that the Germans were not prepared to concede Sicily without a fight. Montgomery's troops met with especially strong German resistance south of Catania, and the British commander was forced to make a detour through the hilly terrain around Mount Etna. It was hot, sweaty, and dusty. The absence of good roadways was a real hindrance, and thirsty foot soldiers were compelled to carry heavy loads of material as the enemy continued to resist. German defenders adopted the tactics of vigorous defense, followed by controlled withdrawal behind destroyed transport routes. It was a procedure that would also reveal itself on the larger battlefield of Italy. As a result, Montgomery's men found progress difficult in late July and early August 1943. By contrast, Patton's army found itself in easier terrain with lighter defenses. Many of the Italian troops surrendered without any sort of fight. At some of the original landing zones, Italian troops helped the Allies ashore. There was now no doubt that many ordinary Italians were disillusioned with their country's alliance with Hitler. Many American troops described the rapturous reception that they received from Sicily's inhabitants. But it still took Patton some 5.5 weeks to reach his objective of Messina, just 2 hours before his British colleagues arrived. The date was August the 17th. Despite the weakness of Italian resistance, the conquest of Sicily was still a costly enterprise. Over 30,000 Allied men were killed, captured, or wounded. But in the final advance on Messina, both Allied armies encountered little in the way of opposition. As early as July the 29th, Field Marshal Kesselring ordered a strategic withdrawal of his forces, and some 100,000 men made it across to the Italian mainland, the majority of them German. The Wehrmacht was still keen to take up the fight. The same could not be said of their Italian allies. Events in Sicily proved once again that many ordinary Italian soldiers did not share the pro-German sentiments of their political master, and Italian politics finally caught up with reality in the course of the Allied offensive. For Mussolini, the loss of Sicily was one humiliation too many. On the 25th of July, in a palace coup, the old dictator was ousted and placed in detention. The 21-year reign of Il Duce was at an end. His replacement was Marshal Pietro Badoglio, who immediately began discussions with the Allies. A change of sides was now on the cards. The fall of Mussolini was a massive boost for the Allied cause, and as September began, the Anglo-American forces in Sicily were preparing the next logical step forward: the conquest of Italy. On the 17th of August 1943, General George S. Patton basked in his own glory as the liberator of Messina. Just 3 weeks later, the Allied conquest of Italy would begin. But Patton would not be involved in the fighting. During the Sicily campaign, the charismatic general made a serious error of judgment. He physically attacked 2 of his own injured men, whom he believed to be cowards. It was an unsavory incident, and Patton was withdrawn from the region. In 1944, he made a memorable comeback in Normandy, but Patton's role in the Italian enterprise came to an end in Sicily. Instead, General Mark Clark took over as commander of the American Fifth Army, part of the Allied 15th Army Group of Harold Alexander, under the overall command of Dwight Eisenhower. By the end of August, Clark's Fifth Army and Montgomery's Eighth knew what their tasks would be in the invasion that lay ahead. In its conception, the attack on Italy was a mainly British idea. Eisenhower and his political masters in Washington were not wholly convinced of its merits. It was made clear to the British that the preparations for the Normandy landings took priority over events in the south. But the American leadership could appreciate that an invasion of Italy was likely to tie down large numbers of German troops. It was almost impossible to imagine Hitler allowing his old ally to fall without a fight. But this meant that fierce German resistance was all but certain, and the Allied commanders knew that another obstacle lay ahead. The Italian landscape itself was also likely to cause serious problems. The land of the Italian peninsula itself represents a formidable opponent for any army set on invasion. In the center of the country, the peaks of the Apennine Mountains dominate the physical environment. Progress northwards is only possible on the flanks, but here too there are peaks, forming a mountainous rib structure extending from the central Italian spine. There are also fast-flowing rivers running between the mountain ribs, set in valleys that provide ideal cover for defensive positions. All the way up the country, Italy is naturally divided into individual blocks of ideal defensive terrain. The line stretching northeast from the coast 100 miles to the south of Rome presents an especially strong natural barrier. But the Allies knew that this area around the mountain known as Cassino would have to be captured. This was the only direct route through to the Lira Valley and the main highway to Rome. In 1943, Monte Cassino itself was the strongest obstacle of all. Its formidable natural defenses had been recognized long before the Second World War. In AD 529, St. Benedict chose to build a great Christian monastery on the peak, and despite wars and sieges over the centuries, the great monastery remained on Monte Cassino in the autumn of 1943. Predictably, the Germans chose to build a substantial defensive line running from coast to coast through the Monte Cassino region. Before the fighting in Sicily was over, Field Marshal Kesselring ordered a devastating structure of mines, booby traps, bunkers, and gun positions to be set up. By the end of the year, the work was completed, presenting another barrier to Allied progress. This was the so-called Winter Line. Around Cassino, the line was strengthened further by its position behind the rivers Garigliano and Rapido, both of which were likely to swell in the rainy months of autumn and winter. In this sector, the line was known as the Gustav Line, and a direct assault against it was bound to be an exhausting enterprise. Even if it was crossed and Rome was then taken, the Allies could also suspect that a skilled defensive force might regroup further north and form new lines to thwart offensive progress. As events transpired, this was exactly the scenario that evolved as the massive forces of the Allies and the Axis engaged on the battlefield of Italy. It is typical of the story of World War II that the entire Italian campaign was seen by many as little more than a diversionary episode. Many Americans in particular shared this view at the time. But if we wish to see the Italian campaign as just a sideshow, then we must also accept that it was a sideshow that involved two whole army groups, comprising hundreds of thousands of men, and it took 20 months for the fighting to reach its conclusion. In that time, the dispositions of the two sides changed, depending on the withdrawals and reinforcements of divisional manpower. Both sides were forced to accept that Italy was not the only theatre of operation at the time. But a typical order of battle showed 20 or more divisions on either side of the Italian front line during the course of the fighting. Inevitably, these included substantial armoured resources. But the nature of the Italian landscape meant that the role of the tank could not be as overwhelming as it was in North Africa. Italy was a battlefield where the talent and endurance of the individual infantryman was often as important as the power of any tank. In the villages and mountains of the Italian peninsula, the skills of the sniper proved invaluable. The ability to endure harsh weather conditions was also essential. On many occasions, fighting ground to a halt as offensives petered out and stalemate battles of attrition began. In these situations, the Allied commanders knew that maintaining morale amongst their men was a vital aspect of their duty. Even the hardest soldiers found it tough going in wet, wintry conditions in the Italian mountains, especially in the absence of any progress in the fighting. For both sides, the big guns had a crucial role to play as the Italian campaign unfolded. On a number of occasions, Allied attacks were preceded by artillery barrages of murderous intensity. The American 155mm gun was just one of the devastating weapons deployed. The Allies could also call on awesome power from the air, as the monks of Monte Cassino found out. But the Germans could also call on huge artillery pieces, including one giant gun that may be the best remembered weapon of the Italian campaign. Gunners on both sides were kept busy throughout the Italian campaign, as were their colleagues the engineers. As the Allies made their slow advance north, their progress was hampered at all stages by the activities of German sappers. German withdrawals were accompanied by the destruction of the transport links that they left behind, and many companies of engineers were given the job of blowing up bridges and roadways. There was also much work to be done when the German command decided to make a stand at a defensive line of their own choosing. Again, the German engineers proved their value by defining the nature of the battlefield. In the course of the fighting, two defensive barriers proved especially tough nuts for the Allies to crack. The Gustav Line to the south of Rome and the Gothic Line to the north. At both locations, German engineers constructed fearsome defenses in a landscape that was already a barrier to progress. Mines and tripwire booby traps were laid. Camouflaged gun emplacements were constructed. 75mm caliber Panzer turrets were set in concrete bases. Anti-tank ditches were dug, and hundreds of miles of barbed wire were laid. the Allied engineers were compelled to counteract the effectiveness of their enemy's works. The mines and booby traps had to be defused. The barbed wire had to be cut. Bailey bridges were required to replace crossings blown by the Germans. Road paths had to be laid so that Allied armor could advance. On many occasions, the Allied engineers were forced to carry out their work as the full force of war raged around them. In one fearsome engagement in the town below Monte Cassino, their task was severely hampered by the activities of their own side. An Allied assault from the air reduced the town to rubble, and it was left to the engineers to make any kind of motorized advance possible. The heavy use of air power was understandable. As the Italian campaign continued, Allied superiority in the air grew more and more decisive. A year into the fighting, the German warplanes in Italy were outnumbered 10-1. From the very beginning of the Italian campaign, the Allies were keen to capture airfields like Foggia near the Adriatic coast, and it was from Foggia that the most infamous operation of the Italian campaign was launched. But the might of American bombers was not enough in itself to secure progress on the ground. And for weeks at a time, the mighty warplanes remained stuck on the ground as rain, snow, and cloud made good visibility impossible. In the final analysis, the most striking difference between the two sides in Italy may not have been defined in strictly military terms. Instead, we may choose to look at the home background of the regiments and divisions involved. The defenders were mainly Germans. Their Allied attackers came from all over the world. The British 8th Army and the American 5th were made up of a bewildering number of nationalities. The British Army was not exclusively British. Just as in North Africa, it drew its manpower from Australia, Canada, and South Africa. New Zealanders were involved in some of the bloodiest engagements. There were Indian contingents, including troops of the legendary Gurkha Rifles. Some Indian soldiers had been engaged continuously since the fighting in Egypt in late 1940, and all Indian units remained keen to get to grips with the enemy in Italy. By early 1944, they were joined by the Polish Corps, a body of 50,000 men who had endured imprisonment in the Soviet Union after their country was carved up under the terms of the 1939 Nazi-Soviet Pact. The Poles of General Anders were also keen to get into the action. So were the troops of the French Expeditionary Force that fought alongside the Americans. Many of these were natives of North Africa, and their experience of mountain conditions in Morocco and Algeria assisted one of the most crucial breakthroughs in the Italian campaign. On this occasion, it was the French commander General Juin who had the vision to recognize what his men could achieve. Allied troops of all nationalities displayed a real enthusiasm for getting to grips with the enemy throughout the Italian campaign. But as in all conflicts, the men on the ground had to rely on the skills of their commanders if their efforts were to be rewarded with victory. By the end of December 1943, one man stood in charge of the entire Allied presence on the Italian mainland. As commander of 15th Army Group, the British General Harold Alexander became Commander-in-Chief of all Allied forces in Italy, when Dwight Eisenhower withdrew to take part in the planning for the Normandy landings. Alexander was a soldier of vast experience, dating back to his service in the First World War. When conflict broke out again in 1939, he was soon involved in the amazing evacuation of the British Army from the beaches of Dunkirk. A senior command in the jungles of Burma followed, before Churchill appointed him Commander-in-Chief of British Middle East Forces in August 1942. It was Alexander who was in overall command of the great victory at El Alamein, and his remarkable career did not end in Egypt. In the battle for Tunisia that followed, Alexander was appointed commander of the Allied 18th Army Group, where he continued to enjoy an excellent relationship with his subordinate General Montgomery. The two men first revealed a mutual respect during the fighting in Egypt, and they continued to work well together in Tunisia and then in Sicily. When the invasion of Italy began, Bernard Montgomery remained as 8th Army commander under his old friend Alexander. But in December 1943, Montgomery was also withdrawn to assist in the D-Day preparations. At that point, command of the 8th Army passed to General Oliver Leese, a protege of Montgomery's, who revealed his battlefield skills as commander of 30th Corps during the fighting at El Alamein. As 1944 dawned, Leese was keen to prove himself once more as the Allies sought progress in the Italian peninsula. But the early months of 1944 were a time when the major Allied offensives were not allocated to the British-led 8th Army, but to the American 5th Army, the command of General Mark Clark. Like its predecessor Patton, Clark was a charismatic showman figure whose good looks belied an astute battlefield brain. When the hot-headed Patton was withdrawn after the invasion of Sicily, Clark was a natural choice to lead the American contingent of the Allied forces in Italy. Another veteran of the First World War, Clark's career in the Second Global Conflict began with his appointment as Eisenhower's deputy during the Tunisia campaign. He then took charge of the new American 5th Army. His responsibility meant that he was deeply involved with some of the most controversial episodes of the Italian campaign. It's widely considered that on one critical occasion, Mark Clark allowed his thirst for personal glory to blind him to the real strategic needs of the Allied cause. But his leadership skills and his undoubted charm enabled him to succeed Alexander as an army group commander before the fighting came to an end. Clark's subordinates included General Bernard Freyberg, commander of the New Zealand Corps within the 5th Army. Like so many other commanders of World War II, Freyberg also saw active service in the First World War. What made him different was the fact that he had secured Britain's highest military award in the course of that fighting. 26 years later, Bernard Freyberg, VC, was still in uniform as commander of New Zealand's 2nd Corps, and his courageous leadership in North Africa had made him a hero amongst his men. In the Italian campaign that followed, Freyberg was answerable to General Mark Clark as his direct superior. But Freyberg was also answerable to the government of New Zealand in respect of the troops he commanded. It may be that his concern for their safety led him to argue for the most notorious Allied decision of the Italian campaign. Sadly, it was a decision that failed to prevent the loss of many young New Zealand men. But the Allies were able to call on reinforcements when needed, and in the spring of 1944 saw the arrival of 50,000 brand new troops on the Italian battlefield. These were the men of Polish 2nd Corps under the command of General Władysław Anders. In the months that followed, Anders' army revealed an intense commitment to the fight. Such passion was essential in the course of a campaign that often took place in the bleakest of fighting environments. The Allies had to deal with a rugged landscape and weather conditions that were often severe. After the fall of Mussolini and the Italian change of sides, it was German troops who were left chiefly responsible for the defense of Italian territory. And in Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, they had a leader they could believe in. The efforts of this gifted soldier made a massive contribution to the difficulties faced by the Allies during the Italian campaign. He was, without doubt, the single dominant figure of the German regional command. Born in 1889, Albert Kesselring first trained as a gunner, but by the end of World War I, his talents had secured him a place on Imperial Germany's General Staff. In the 1930s, he joined the Young Luftwaffe, and by 1939, he was a Luftflotte commander during the invasion of Poland. Kesselring enjoyed a similar command during the Battle of Britain, and despite the German defeat, his career continued to advance. By the time of the Tunisia campaign, Kesselring was commander-in-chief of all German armed forces in the Mediterranean theatre. But it was during the Italian campaign that he revealed the full extent of his talent. Time and again, Kesselring proved that he knew his battlefield, and his decisions meant that for much of the time, the Allied campaign was fought on terms dictated by the German commander. Sadly, Kesselring's reputation was sullied by an order given by him in March 1944. In German-controlled Rome, a local resistance group carried out a bomb attack in which 35 SS men died. As a response, the German field marshal ordered the killing of 335 hostages. It was a decision held against him after the war, and Albert Kesselring was convicted of war crimes and sentenced to death. Though the sentence was eventually commuted, the stain on his reputation remained. Many Italians continue to curse the name of Albert Kesselring. But there can be no doubt that in military terms alone, the German commander in Italy proved himself as a leader in the face of the Allied offensive. Of course, the quality of leadership was an important factor for both sides in the Italian conflict. The maintenance of morale was a vital consideration. For the individual soldier on the ground, daily life could be a bleak experience. Not just because of the weather or the landscape, but because both sides knew the extent of the firepower available to their enemy. The Italian campaign may not be remembered as an air war, but there were occasions when the Allies needed to call on the destructive power of the heavy bomber. The most famous bombing raid of all was carried out by three types of American warplane: the twin-engined B-25 Mitchells and B-26 Marauders, and the mighty four-engined B-17, the Flying Fortress. A giant of the air, the Boeing Flying Fortress first took off in 1935, and by the time of the Italian campaign, the Type G had already proved itself in Europe. German civilians knew only too well that the 2,000-mile range of the B-17 meant that it became a nightly fixture in German skies. With a bomb load of some 8 tons, it proved ideal for the strategic bombing offensive against Germany. But in Italy, the Flying Fortress was also deployed in a tactical role, with equally devastating effect. For sheer destructive power, the B-17 had few rivals, as events at Monte Cassino proved. Allied commanders could also call on massive firepower on the ground. Italy was a battlefield that proved the continuing importance of artillery fire, and the big guns were exactly that. The American M1 had a caliber of 155 millimeters. Its shells weighed over 92 pounds, and its range of almost 5 miles made it ideal for delivering the kind of indirect artillery fire that saps the morale of the toughest soldier. American gunners appreciated the accuracy of the weapon, which soon earned the nickname Long Tom. America's allies also found the M1 to be an ideal heavy artillery piece. The Long Tom was part of the British arsenal well before the end of the war. Another American design that entered British service was the M4 tank, known to the British as the Sherman. At El Alamein, the Sherman proved itself in battle, and although the Italian landscape provided fewer opportunities for tank warfare, Allied commanders knew they had an excellent machine when armoured actions were called for. Its protection was a maximum of 75 millimeters. Its main gun delivered a thumping 75 millimeter caliber shell. Its top speed was 29 miles per hour. The American constructors knew that this was an ideal combination. In the course of the war, over 48,000 Shermans were built, more than any other tank anywhere in the world. In a war where armoured capabilities were crucial, the Sherman proved itself time and time again. But the Italian campaign also revealed the continuing importance of the individual infantryman on the ground, and British soldiers knew that they had a rifle they could trust in action. The original Lee-Enfield weapon was first introduced as far back as 1895. The Enfield No. 4 was first issued in 1903. By the time of the Second World War, this was still the standard issue rifle in the British Army. Italy was a battlefield where the skills of the sniper were often required. The Enfield No. 4 gave the skilled British sniper the reliability he needed to hit a 4-inch target at up to 200 yards, a range that proved ideal for the rugged, close-quarter fighting that took place in Italy. But the No. 4 provided more than just accuracy. The superb design of the bolt action meant that the weapon could deliver some 30 rounds a minute. This was the case as early as 1914, when British infantry used the No. 4 at the Battle of Mons. 30 years later, on the battlefield of Italy, the Lee-Enfield No. 4 remained much the same, and it was still the trusted weapon of the British riflemen. But Britain and her allies didn't have a monopoly of excellent weapons in Italy, and the Germans also enjoyed the ability to position their firepower in deliberate, strong positions. As the defenders, Kesselring's forces were able to establish camouflaged emplacements equipped with powerful machine guns. And of all the weapons available to the German machine gunner, the MG42 remains the most famous of all. The MG42 began to establish its reputation on the battlefields of North Africa and the Soviet Union. German machine gunners were quick to appreciate the smooth feed of the 50-cartridge belt. They could also take advantage of a remarkable rate of fire. Some 1,550 rounds a minute could be delivered by the MG42, and it's not surprising that the weapon remains in service in many armies of the present day. For the German infantrymen, the Italian campaign also revealed the importance of the mortar in battle. The high angle of fire that a mortar provides proved ideal in the Italian conditions, as Allied troops were able to confirm. The German 8-centimeter weapon fired an 8-pound bomb, and a well-trained crew could deliver an enviable rate of fire to a range of up to half a mile. Mortars like this gained the respect of the Allies in Italy and elsewhere, and the 8-centimeter design again proved the value of the weapon referred to as the infantryman's artillery. But if the Germans wanted to call on heavy gunfire in Italy, they were rarely short of options. On occasions when Allied armour was deployed, the 7.5-centimeter anti-tank gun could be brought into the fray. With a range of 1.5 miles, the PaK-40 was typically used to fire 9-pound shells straight into the enemy line. But it was at closer ranges that the PaK-40 revealed its real strength. At a range of 1/3 of a mile, its shells could penetrate armour to a thickness of over 150 millimeters, and this was more than sufficient to deal with any armoured vehicles available to the Allies. But of all the German weapons used in Italy, the most famous of all of them was nothing less than a monster, the K5 railway gun. This was an artillery piece so big that it needed to be mounted on a railway carriage. After deployment, it could be hidden in tunnels, safe from the attentions of Allied bombers. Even today, its specifications are awesome. Its caliber was 28 centimeters. Its shells weighed 1/4 ton. Its range was over 50 miles. In January 1944, the Allies encountered this stupendous weapon for the first time, and it remains known by the nickname given to it then. The K5's shells were fired against an Allied amphibious landing at a coastal village 40 miles to the south of Rome, a village whose name has become synonymous with deadlock and stalemate in war. This was the village of Anzio, and the K5 became known as Anzio Annie. In the early months of 1944, this amazing machine played a huge part in battering the Allies at the Anzio beachhead, and its impact was as much psychological as physical. But Anzio was not the first amphibious landing of the Allied offensive in Italy. In August 1943, the Allied command decided to make a first assault further south, as part of a twin-pronged assault against the Italian mainland. This was the thinking for the beginning of the Italian campaign, and by early September, the Allied plan was ready to be put into action. With the fall of Sicily and the ousting of Mussolini, the Allied command were keen to strike as soon as possible against the Italian mainland. By the beginning of September, the British-led 8th Army and the American 5th Army were ready for the offensive. As we've seen, these were armies that drew their strength from all over the world, and many of them were already seasoned veterans of the Second World War. The Allied plan was straightforward. In the south, Montgomery's men would make the short sea crossing from Sicily. Once across, they were tasked with seizing the port of Reggio di Calabria before beginning the advance north. This part of the invasion was codenamed Operation Baytown. This could be seen as an attack on Italy's toe, but the plan also called for British airborne troops to land on the heel at the port of Taranto. This support landing was given the codename Slapstick. With these two objectives achieved, the British troops were to advance towards Italy's central regions, where, if all went well, they would be joined by their American colleagues. The job of Mark Clark's 5th Army was more demanding. Operation Avalanche called for the American troops to make an amphibious landing at the port of Salerno, further north. The Allies would have liked to attack further north still, but Salerno represented the most distant objective that could be protected by Allied fighters launched from Sicilian airfields. If Clark's men succeeded in establishing a beachhead at Salerno, it could be used as a starting point for the advance north, in combination with the 8th Army arriving from further south. The first big prize would be Naples, and then Rome itself could be taken. But to do this, the Allies would have to break through the line of German defences in the central mountains, and defence was the key to the German thinking in the Italian campaign. In the battle for Sicily, the German tactics gave the Allies a hint of the kind of fighting that lay ahead on the Italian mainland. After Sicily had fallen, Field Marshal Albert Kesselring was determined that any Allied progress on the mainland would be hard fought, and he devised a strategy to achieve his objective. When German forces did make contact with the enemy, their task was to engage and then, if necessary, make an organized withdrawal, taking care to destroy transport links as they departed. Kesselring knew that the Italian terrain provided an ideal landscape for a series of fortified defensive lines, the most important of which were the Gothic line in the north and the Winter line in the center. This was the defense that included the sector known as the Gustav line. Kesselring knew that natural obstacles like Monte Cassino would have to be captured if the Allies wanted to secure a path to Rome through the Liri Valley. He also knew that his enemy might be tempted to make an amphibious or airborne outflanking move to secure a position behind the defensive lines. So the German Field Marshal maintained substantial forces in reserve to deal with any Allied outflanking maneuver. Ideally, he hoped to push any Allied beachhead back into the sea. Failing that, he could trap them on the beaches and prevent a breakout. At the coastal town of Anzio, Allied troops had plenty of time to appreciate the skillful planning of Albert Kesselring. But even before the Italian campaign began, the British and Americans knew that the task ahead was likely to be tough, and there was little doubt that the enemy would be fully motivated. But the campaign began with some excellent news for the Allied cause. On the eve of the Salerno landings, the formal surrender of the Italian state was broadcast around the world.
Armistice with Italy has been concluded. It is a great victory for the United Nations, but it was also a great victory for the Italian people. After years of war and suffering and degradation, the Italian people are at last coming to the day of liberation from their real enemies, the Nazis. But let us not delude ourselves that this armistice means the end of war in the Mediterranean. We must drive the Germans out of Italy as we have driven them out of Tunisia and Sicily. We must drive them out of France and all other captive countries.
On the 8th of September 1943, the Allied leadership could be forgiven for believing that the tide of the Second World War was now with them. Great victories had already been secured. Egypt, Tunisia, Sicily. Now it was the turn of Italy, and many Allied soldiers could imagine another decisive triumph ahead. But the reality would be very different. At the beginning of September 1943, the British-led 8th Army of General Montgomery prepared for another major campaign of World War II. Monte's men had already become legends as they fought their way from El Alamein across North Africa into Tunisia, and then across the Mediterranean into Sicily. Now the desert rats prepared to fight in conditions very different from those found in North Africa. On September the 3rd, 8th Army troops crossed the Straits of Messina to land at the town of Reggio. 6 days later, a supporting landing secured the objectives of Taranto and Brindisi to the east. As both elements began moving north, Monte's men were on the march once again, and the battle for Italy had begun. But the Allied objectives required more than just the divisions of Montgomery. On September the 9th, another Allied army arrived in Italy. Further north, the American-led 5th Army put ashore at the port of Salerno. This was Operation Avalanche. The aim was to secure a beachhead before moving north to capture the city of Naples. With this achieved, the two Allied armies would join forces and sweep up through the Italian peninsula towards Rome and beyond. As the American 5th Army approached the coast, there were many men who thought the task ahead would be simple. In the hours before the Avalanche landings, the news was announced to the world that Italy had surrendered to the Allies. Mussolini had already fallen. Il Duce was now in captivity, and the official Italian state would soon re-enter the war on the Allied side. But as the men on the transport ships celebrated the Italian surrender, anyone who underestimated the task ahead was in for a surprise. German troops were still present in force on the Italian peninsula. Within hours of the first landings at Salerno, the American-led 5th Army knew they were in for a real fight to control Italy. We can now see the 9th of September 1943 as the start of one of the longest, bloodiest, and bitterest campaigns of the Second World War. It would last 20 months. The fighting took place in bleak weather and difficult terrain that strongly favored the German defenders. At times, the fighting was more typical of the First World War than the Second. the Allies faced an enemy that was well equipped, well motivated, and especially well led. By contrast, the decisions of the Allied commanders were often mired in controversy. Events that took place at locations like Anzio and Monte Cassino are not remembered as glorious contributions to Allied victory. Even when successes were achieved in Italy, they could be seen as of dubious strategic value. By the time the Italian campaign came to an end, it was regarded by many as a forgotten war, a mere sideshow to more dramatic events elsewhere. But the Italian campaign was a very real matter to those engaged in it. In the end, Allied victory was achieved, and Italy remains one of the most intriguing of all battlefields of the Second World War. On the evening of the 8th of September 1943, the American General Mark Clark prepared for the biggest moment of his life, as his Fifth Army made ready for the landings at Salerno. Under his command was the British 10th Corps and the American 6th Corps. At the time, this was the biggest amphibious landing of the war. The plan was to secure a beachhead at Salerno before 10th Corps moved north to capture the port of Naples, while 6th Corps broke out southeast to meet up with the British 8th Army. Clark knew that Montgomery was already advancing through southern Italy with his 8th drawn from all over the British Commonwealth and Empire. When the two armies joined together, they could advance side by side north, in the direction of Germany itself. But the progress of the 8th Army faced little opposition in the Italian south. The German regional commander, Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, suspected that the main Allied assault would be launched further north, in the vicinity of Naples, so he deployed a total of 8 divisions in the region, with his 16th Panzer Division positioned at Salerno itself. Despite the surrender of Italy, the Allied landings would not be unopposed. The American 6th Corps met with an especially vigorous response when the Salerno landings began at 0310 hours on the 9th of September. By the end of day 1, the Fifth Army had secured just 4 small beachheads, as Albert Kesselring dispatched as many of his panzers as he could to the coast. By the 11th of September, 4 divisions of the Fifth Army were ashore, but 5 panzer divisions of the German 10th Army were ready to resist their advance. The British were unable to break through to the road to Naples. The Americans could not break out to the south, and the Salerno landings were soon in trouble. Mark Clark's decision to land along a 35-mile front meant that his forces were too widely spread to support each other effectively. On the 12th of September, Albert Kesselring ordered his armoured divisions to make a counterattack, which almost succeeded in splitting the Fifth Army in 2 along the line of the River Sele. For a time, Mark Clark pondered the idea of withdrawal as his army fought back desperately. Had he made such a decision just days after the surrender of Italy, it would have been a catastrophe for the Allied cause. In the end, it was the might of Allied naval guns and bombing from the air that held back the German counterattack. Late in the day on the 14th of September, the German commander ordered his divisions to withdraw to the north, and at last the Salerno beachhead was secure. 6 days later, Clark's Fifth Army joined up with Montgomery's 8th at Ponticelli. By the 5th of October, Allied troops entered Naples, and the first objectives of the Italian campaign had been achieved. But there was a price to pay. Fifth Army's casualties were some 12,000. The campaign was still far from over, and an old Allied foe was back at liberty. As the fighting for Salerno raged, Benito Mussolini was freed from captivity in a daring commando raid. The old dictator was installed as the ruler of a new Italian state, But there was no doubt that the real power in Italy was now the Germans, with Albert Kesselring the key figure in the fight against the Allies, though Field Marshal Erwin Rommel was still commander in northern Italy at the time. Kesselring had already worked out his strategy to deal with an Allied invasion. After discussions with Hitler, the German commander decided to abandon southern Italy altogether. Instead, Kesselring decided to concentrate his forces in the north, behind powerful lines of defences. The German commander knew his Italian battlefield well. The landscape of the Italian peninsula itself represents a formidable opponent for any army set on invasion. The spine of the country is dominated by the peaks of the Apennine Mountains. Progress northwards is only possible on the flanks. But here too there are peaks, forming a mountainous rib structure extending from the central spine. Between the ribs, fast-flowing rivers add to the difficulties of progress through valleys that themselves provide excellent defensive cover. Predictably, the Germans added to the difficulties of progress by constructing a series of fortified lines constructed across the peninsula. In simple terms, the terrain of central Italy could almost have been designed for defensive warfare. The Apennines meant that the two Allied armies were divided, with Montgomery's men advancing to the east, while Clark's Fifth Army moved forward to the west. But in the weeks after the Allied landings, progress became painfully slow. The Germans adopted the tactic of engaging the enemy before making a tactical withdrawal, having destroyed bridges and other transport routes leading north. Kesselring knew that the two Allied armies would eventually have to deal with a massive barrier to further progress. The line stretching northeast from the coast 100 miles to the south of Rome was and remains a huge natural barrier against any invasion. But the Allies knew that they would have to break through the line around a mountain 20 miles inland from the Tyrrhenian coast. Capturing the mountain was the only direct means of advancing through to the Liri Valley and the main highway to Rome. The name of the peak was Monte Cassino. This was the strongest obstacle of all. Cassino's formidable natural defences had been recognised long before the Second World War. In AD 529, St. Benedict chose to build a great Christian monastery on the summit. Despite wars and sieges over the centuries, a great monastery remained on Monte Cassino in the autumn of 1943, and the Allies were reluctant to consider an attack on such a major historic monument. Predictably, the Germans chose to build a substantial defensive line running from coast to coast through the Monte Cassino region. Before the fighting in Sicily was over, Field Marshal Kesselring ordered a devastating structure of mines, booby traps, bunkers, and gun positions to be set up. By the end of the year, the work was complete, presenting another massive barrier to Allied progress. This was the so-called Winter Line, running from Minturno to San Vito. To the north, the line was strengthened further by its position behind the river Sangro. In the south, the Allies would have to cross the rivers Garigliano and Rapido, both of which were likely to swell in the rainy months of autumn and winter. In this sector, the line was known as the Gustav Line, and a direct assault against it was bound to be an exhausting enterprise. It was a hard task just to reach the line. It was the 2nd of December by the time the 8th Army crossed the Sangro, and it took until the 28th of December for the 1st Canadian Division to capture the town of Ortona after ferocious close-quarter fighting. Further south, the 5th Army also struggled to seize objectives such as Monte Maggiore, Monte Sammucro, and Monte Cammino. So many shells were needed to take Monte Cammino that the peak earned the nickname Million Dollar Hill, as the harsh winter weather began to alter the nature of the battlefield. By the end of the year, the Allied advance had ground to a halt in both sectors. As men of both sides spent a miserable Christmas on patrol in the grim winter weather, the battle for Italy became a bleak stalemate, and the 5th Army had still not crossed the rivers Rapido and Garigliano. The breaking of the winter line would be a task for the new year, and it would not be easy. Behind his defences, Kesselring deployed his 1st Parachute Division, his 51st Mountain Corps, and his crucial 14th Panzer Corps in the Gustav Line sector. It was here that the real struggle would begin again in earnest, and new commanders would be involved. In December, Eisenhower was withdrawn from Italy to join the preparations for the D-Day landings. His replacement was General Harold Alexander, who now took overall command of the combined Allied 15th Army Group. Alexander's old subordinate Montgomery was also withdrawn to prepare for the Normandy landings. Command of the 8th Army now passed to General Oliver Leese. Around the same time, Erwin Rommel also left Italy, leaving Albert Kesselring in complete charge of German-held territory on the peninsula. Kesselring suspected that the new Allied command was likely to make an assault against the crucial sector of the Gustav Line early in the new year, and he was right in his assumption. In the early days of 1944, Alexander and his senior commanders conceived a bold new objective for Clark's 5th Army. The plan was to make a direct assault against the line, combined with a new amphibious landing from the rear. If it was successful, the Germans could be enveloped in a vast pincer movement, leaving the way open for a great symbolic prize 40 miles to the north, the eternal city of Rome. But as events transpired, the locations chosen for the attacks would become 2 of the most notorious battlefields of the Second World War: Anzio and Monte Cassino. On the 17th of January 1944, the 5th Army of General Mark Clark advanced against the Gustav Line, and the Battle of Monte Cassino began. If Clark had known that it would be only the first of 4 terrible battles, then he might have preferred a different means of pursuing success in Italy. Three separate corps of troops were deployed in the Cassino sector, including the French Expeditionary Corps of Alphonse Juin, a body of men that included North African soldiers well equipped for mountain warfare. Further south, the British 10th Corps were tasked with advancing towards the river Garigliano. In blizzard conditions, the British succeeded in crossing the river despite the vigorous attentions of a well-defended enemy. 10th Corps soon established a bridgehead of some 2 miles depth. But when the British tried to capture the peak of Mount Mayo, their offensive ground to a halt on the high ground. To the north, American 2nd Corps also sought a bridgehead across the Rapido, a river whose fast-flowing, swollen water made its name appropriate, as the men of the Texan 36th Division soon found out. Simply crossing the river proved a nightmare, as the sound of concealed machine gun fire filled the winter air. Despite this, the Texans managed to gain a bridgehead, but their success was short-lived. After 2 days, a decimated force was compelled to retreat across the river. Their colleagues in the 34th Division enjoyed slightly greater success further north, only to be forced back just a few hundred yards from Monte Cassino itself. Furthest north of all, the French Algerians and Moroccans also made progress before being held. Later, these hardy North African troops would make a far more dramatic move against the Gustav Line, but in January and early February, no breakthrough was possible. By the time the exhausted Allies abandoned the offensive on February the 11th, it was clear that the attack had failed and heavy casualties had been taken. The first part of the pincer movement had not succeeded, and General Clark knew that the second part was also in trouble. On the 22nd of January 1944, the small coastal village of Anzio was the location for one of the most successful amphibious landings of the Second World War. That day, an armada of Allied ships put ashore a total of 36,000 men, with virtually nothing in the way of resistance. The town had already been evacuated, and there were no German forces waiting to greet the amphibious landing force. These were the men of 5th Army's 6th Corps, under the command of Major General John Lucas. This was a combined Anglo-American force, and the men of the British 1st Division and the American 3rd Division were pleased to go ashore without opposition. The German presence in the Anzio region as a whole was insubstantial. For Albert Kesselring, this was a worrying situation, and he rushed to send reinforcements to Anzio. The day after the landings, Colonel General von Mackensen took command of the 14th Army, tasked with resisting the Allied advance. It was to be a substantial force, with divisions sent from as far away as the Balkans and France, as well as other regions of Italy. But these new forces would take time to arrive, and with the initial success of the amphibious landing, General Lucas had the chance to break out of Anzio towards highways 6 and 7. With only a small German presence in the region at the time, 6th Corps could cut off the main supply lines to the German 10th Army and open the way to Rome itself. Hitler recognized the danger. It was the Führer himself who insisted that Kesselring's reinforcements should come from outside Italy. But in the immediate aftermath of the Anzio landings, the commander of 6th Corps had a priceless opportunity to break the deadlock in Italy. General John Lucas failed to seize the moment. In a terrible miscalculation, the Corps commander decided to wait until his full complement of men and material was landed and his beachhead was fully secure. Only on the 30th of January, 8 days after the landing, did Lucas order a general breakout, with the Americans and British dispatched in the directions of Cisterna and Campoleone. Both were repulsed by the now substantial German presence in the region. By the following day, no fewer than 8 German divisions surrounded the Allied beachhead, and a glorious opportunity was lost forever. Churchill was angry and bewildered. Having conceived the Anzio landings, the British leader was furious with the slow reactions of the American commander. "I had hoped we were hurling a wildcat onto the shore," he said afterwards, "but all we got was a beached whale." Worse was to come. On February the 6th, the German 14th Army began the process of reducing the Allied beachhead in a grim assault on the perimeter of the 6th Corps line. For the men trapped behind the line, one devastating German weapon now revealed its firepower. This was the 28-centimeter K5 railway gun, a monster artillery piece whose shells weighed a quarter of a ton. With a range of over 50 miles, the K5 could fire on the Allied troops at will. The Germans nicknamed the K5 the Leopold. The unfortunate Allies referred to it as Anzio Annie. The tactical value of such a huge caliber weapon was always only part of its purpose. Newsreel footage of a 28-centimeter gun always looked good on the German home front, while the sheer range of the K5 made its fire an unsettling experience for the Allied troops stuck at Anzio. On February the 16th, the situation became even worse for the Allies, when von Mackensen unleashed a full-scale counterattack against the Anzio beachhead, deploying 6 divisions of his 14th Army in an attempt to push the British and Americans back into the sea. For the second time in the Italian campaign, an Allied beachhead was in real trouble. But as at Salerno, the German counterattack was eventually held. Now the big American guns, like the 180mm Long Tom, brought their power to bear. A total of 432 Allied artillery pieces were deployed, along with a simultaneous assault from offshore naval weapons and American bombers dispatched from bases in southern Italy. This devastating display of firepower was all needed to save the Allies from disaster. but it did not save the job of the 6th Corps commander at Anzio. On the 22nd of February, 3 days after the German attack was halted, General John Lucas was sacked, to be replaced by General Lucien Truscott. But the new Corps commander could do nothing to make up for his predecessor's lack of boldness after the Anzio landings. The Allied troops were now stuck in a small pocket around the port. The Germans had only to hold them, and Anzio Annie could carry on her grim work at leisure. There was nothing that could be done about this monster gun. As soon as it had fired, it retreated into a railway tunnel, safely out of reach of Allied bombs. As February turned into March, it was clear that the grand plans for a pincer movement had failed completely. Stalemate was now the order of the day, and German propaganda leaflets taunted the Allies for their failures at Anzio. In February and March 1944, the commanders of the Fifth Army discovered a fundamental truth of warfare. Devastating firepower is often not enough in itself. In the aftermath of the first failed attempt to break through the Gustav Line, the decimated American Second Corps was withdrawn, to be replaced by the New Zealand Second Corps. This was a combined force of New Zealanders, British and Indians, under the command of General Bernard Freyberg. Freyberg was a legendary New Zealand officer whose heroics in North Africa followed on from his achievements in World War I, when he won the Victoria Cross. Having taken over the Second Corps sector, Freyberg was keen to make an assault against Cassino town, Monte Calvario, and Monte Cassino itself. But there was one major problem: the 1,400-year-old monastery on the top of the mountain. Under international law, such a major Christian monument was a no-go area for military action. The Germans claimed to respect this. Towards the end of 1943, in a blaze of publicity, they removed the precious art and artifacts contained within the monastery. Without a hint of irony, the Wehrmacht presented itself as the guardian of civilized values. In February 1944, the Allies reinforced the message. Freyberg was convinced that the monastery was being used for enemy artillery observation and argued that it had to be destroyed before his new assault could begin. When General Alexander accepted Freyberg's view, the fate of the ancient monastery was sealed. On the 15th of February 1944, a total of 229 American bombers arrived in 3 waves in the skies over Monte Cassino. 47 B-25 Mitchells, 40 B-26 Marauders, and no fewer than 142 4-engined B-17 Flying Fortresses were deployed. Their aggregate bomb load was 453 tons, and in a matter of hours, 14 centuries of history was reduced to rubble. The bomber crews had done their job, but the whole enterprise was a disaster for the Allies. Freyberg's intelligence had been incorrect. The Germans had not been in the monastery. But with the Allies' violation of international law, elite German parachute troops moved into the rubble and found themselves in a perfect defensive position. The day after the bombing, the 2nd New Zealand Corps made its move, but the Indians and New Zealanders failed to make the breakthrough. The Indians fought hard, but the German defenders in the monastery ruins forced them back. The 8-centimeter German mortar proved an especially valuable infantry weapon, both at the monastery ruins and to the south, the New Zealanders failed in their attempt to break through the German defences at Cassino town itself. Here, a detachment of Maori troops crossed the Rapido River, but struggled to make any progress in the town. Though they succeeded in capturing the railway station under cover of smoke generators, the Maori infantry lacked anything in the way of armoured support. Allied tanks like the Shermans were unable to cross the river. As a result, just 2 panzers were able to pummel the Maori positions. With British units also unable to capture the essential objective of Monte Calvario, the offensive was abandoned after just 3 days. The bombing of the monastery had achieved nothing. But General Freyberg remained convinced that massive firepower was the way to break through at Monte Cassino. The bombing of the 15th of February was devastating. The Allied assault, unleashed exactly a month later, almost defies description. That day, no fewer than 775 bombers and fighter bombers dropped a total of 1,250 tons of explosive on the town of Cassino. Immediately afterwards, the artillery opened up. 750 guns fired a total of 195,000 shells in just 2 hours against a target 1 mile wide. After this, Cassino no longer existed in anything but name, and Freyberg was convinced that no one could have survived. But he was wrong. Amazingly, 100 German paratroopers had withstood the onslaught, and with reinforcements drafted in to meet the advance of Freyberg's men, the New Zealanders and Indians were faced with a now familiar story. This time, Freyberg was determined to bring his armour into the fray. But in the ruins of Cassino, mobility was all but impossible, despite the best efforts of his engineers to clear paths through the rubble. For the infantry, movement was equally tough. The whole town was littered with mines, and the rubble made perfect defensive cover for rifle and machine gun fire. Despite the tough fighting conditions, a detachment of courageous New Zealanders succeeded in capturing Cassino's railway station. To the north, the Allied troops also succeeded in capturing a number of smaller hills, but the essential objective of Monte Cassino remained elusive. The whole of the Italian campaign was turning into a nightmare for the Allies. To the north of the Winter Line, the 8th Army was still deadlocked. At Anzio, Truscott's 6th Corps remained stuck in the pocket, and Kesselring's Germans still held the Gustav Line intact. By the end of March, Mark Clark's 5th Army had sustained over 52,000 casualties since the first offensive in January. New thinking was required in the Allied command if the breakthrough was to be achieved. April 1944 saw a lull in the fighting on the Winter Line and at Anzio as both sides paused for breath and waited for better spring weather. For the Allies, it was a time of reinforcing and redisposing the forces of Alexander's 15th Army Group. When the proposed invasion of southern France was postponed, Alexander received men previously allocated for an operation which would eventually take place in August. His 8th Army was also boosted by the deployment of the Polish 2nd Corps, a total of 50,000 men known as Anders' Army, after their commander, General Władysław Anders. With Clark's 5th Army having suffered so badly, Alexander decided to redeploy much of Oliver Lee's 8th Army for a new assault against the Gustav Line. The army boundary was moved south. The British 10th Corps was transferred to 8th Army, and their position on the Garigliano River was taken by the 4 divisions of the French Expeditionary Corps. By early May, Alexander had decided to launch a massive assault against a 20-mile sector of front, using no fewer than 12 of his divisions. Anders' Poles were positioned to the north of Cassino, with the British 13th Corps immediately to the south. On the coast, the American 2nd Corps were deployed, with the French completing the disposition to the right of the Fifth Army line. Against this massive offensive force were just 6 divisions of the German 10th Army. Despite this, Kesselring and his commanders felt certain about one thing: the Allies could not make a break through the Arucci Mountains. The terrain was surely impassable. Monte Petrella alone was over 5,000 feet high, and this was just one mighty peak in the Arucci chain. But the French General Juin had other ideas. When the Allied offensive began on the evening of the 11th of May, his experienced African mountain troops intended to advance directly into the Arucci. Predictably, the assault began with another massive artillery barrage, and the newly deployed Poles were quickly into the fight at Cassino. But the Germans again mounted a stiff defense, inflicting heavy losses on Anders' men as the British struggled to break through into the Liri Valley below. In the Fifth Army sector, developments were more promising for the Allies. Within 2 days, the Americans were making good progress towards Formia, despite the attentions of 14th Panzer Corps. But it was the French who made the decisive move. By the 13th of May, Juin's men had captured Monte Maggio. 2 days later, provisioned with goats on the hoof, these hardy mountain soldiers captured the fearsome Monte Petrella, and the way was clear for the French to move north, behind the Germans, into the Liri Valley. It was a remarkable achievement, and Kesselring knew he had to make another one of his tactical withdrawals. When the Poles finally reached the ruins of Monte Cassino on May the 18th, the Germans had already departed. After 4 months of struggle and controversy, the ruins of the monastery were at last in Allied hands. With 2nd Corps still advancing along the coast, Kesselring withdrew a division from the Anzio perimeter to resist the American advance towards Terracina. But the situation was now critical for the German Field Marshal. The Anzio beachhead had been substantially reinforced, and on the 23rd of May, the men of 6th Corps broke out of the perimeter after 4 months of deadlock. 2 days later, the 6th Corps and 2nd Corps of Mark Clark's 5th Army finally joined up to the north of Lake Fogliano. The German 10th Army was now in full retreat along the Liri Valley, and there was now the opportunity for Clark to move his divisions north to trap the Germans near Valmontone. A massive victory was within the Allies' grasp, but Mark Clark had other ideas. The 5th Army commander chose to send only one token division north. The rest he dispatched in the direction of Rome. In purely military terms, the Italian capital wasn't much of an objective. The German 14th Army was in no position to defend the city. On the 1st of June, Kesselring gave the order to withdraw from Rome, and 3 days later, Mark Clark duly arrived in the Eternal City at the head of his 5th Army. The Roman population was ecstatic. Clark basked in the glory as the liberator of the Eternal City. But by going to Rome, Mark Clark lost the Allies the chance to inflict a catastrophic defeat on the German presence in Italy. As the American commander basked in the acclaim, Kesselring was already organizing an effective retreat to a powerful new defensive line to the north. The hasty capture of Rome was a hollow victory, and Clark's own glory was short-lived. 2 days after his arrival in the city, news of the D-Day landings swept across the front pages of the world's newspapers. Italy was once again relegated to a sideshow, and the campaign was still far from over. Another formidable line of German defenses would have to be breached. Unknown to the Allies in the warm June sunshine, another bitter winter lay ahead. In July 1943, as the Allies fought their way through Sicily, work began on a line of Axis defences far away to the north on the Italian mainland. This was known as the Gothic Line, stretching some 200 miles from just north of Pisa on the Tyrrhenian coast across the Apennines to Pesaro on the Adriatic. By the time of the fall of Rome, the Gothic Line fortifications were still far from finished. Hitler himself intervened to order that the construction work be completed. Between June and August, an army of Italian and German engineers and labourers set about the task of beefing up the Gothic Line. By the time their work was finished, they had built a formidable line of defence up to 10 miles deep. There were over 2,300 machine gun positions, almost 500 mortar and anti-tank positions, many fitted with the PaK-40 75mm weapon. The fortifications also included a small number of panzer turret guns of similar caliber set into a concrete base. And as if this wasn't enough, the work parties also laid over 1,000 miles of barbed wire to hamper any infantry advance. As soon as Rome had fallen, Kesselring knew that the Gothic Line would be the focal point of his next stand against the Allies. Typically, his men continued to harass the invaders as the Germans made the retreat north from Rome in July and August 1944. By the time Kesselring's Army Group C was in position at the line in mid-August, he knew that the battle for Italy was still far from over. His supreme commander, Hitler, was desperate to hold the Allies back on the Italian peninsula. The Führer ordered 7 new divisions to be sent to Italy, as well as the equivalent of 3 more to replace men lost during the retreat from the Winter Line. By contrast, the Allies lost resources during the summer of 1944. A total of 7 divisions were withdrawn from the Fifth Army to take part in Operation Anvil, the invasion of southern France, which eventually began on the 15th of August. Mark Clark lost his 6th Corps and most of his French troops for the Anvil campaign. But the Fifth Army and the 8th Army were still able to enjoy a brief interlude of sunshine and movement as they pursued the Germans north. By early August, the Fifth Army had reached a position just short of the Gothic Line at the River Arno, as the 8th Army advanced to the Maturno on the other side of the Apennines. Alexander was now keen to launch a concerted attack against the German defences while the weather still held, but he knew that he would have to be cunning to break a well-defended and well-led enemy line. On the 25th of August 1944, the Anglo-American 15th Army Group began its attack on the right flank of its line. Alexander's ultimate objective was to reach the line of the River Po and then cross it. If he could achieve this, any remaining resistance would be pushed back towards the Alps and the German Reich itself, and the battle for Italy would be all but over. Once again, a huge artillery barrage heralded the 8th Army's crossing of the River Maturno, while the 5th Army attacked on the other side of the peninsula, taking Pisa on the 2nd of September. Kesselring could not be sure which of these was the main Allied thrust and which was a feint. He decided that the real Allied ambitions were with the 5th Army. But neither of these initial assaults represented the main force of the Allied assault. As the fighting continued on both flanks, Alexander was able to concentrate the full force of the 8th Army on a narrow front on the coast north of Ancona. It required the movement of no fewer than 8 divisions from inland positions, along with 80,000 vehicles. Yet the redisposition was achieved in just 15 days, and the Germans were kept in the dark. On the 12th of September, the real attack on the Gothic Line began. By the 20th of September, the concentrated power of the 8th Army had broken through the line, with the Canadians leading the way. But it was a detachment of newly formed Greeks who succeeded in capturing the town of Rimini on the 20th of September, as Bernard Freyberg's veteran New Zealanders sought to press home the advantage beyond. This typifies the international nature of the Allied force in Italy, and this would be reinforced in October with the arrival of a Brazilian expeditionary corps. With the German defenders forced to engage on two sectors, Mark Clark's Fifth Army also succeeded in breaking through the Gothic line defences. Casualties were heavy as engineers cut through the barbed wire and defused the mines that seemed to go on for mile after mile. But Clark was determined to progress towards the city of Bologna. This was where the main Highway 9 could be reached. If the road was taken, Kesselring's 10th Army in the east would be cut off from its supply routes. Clark was prepared to take terrible casualties in the mountain passes as his men endured withering enemy fire from gun positions hidden among the peaks. Kesselring knew the consequences if the Allies captured the highway and concentrated his forces on resisting Clark's advance. The might of 5 panzer divisions were brought to bear against the Americans, and Clark's assault eventually ground to a halt in mid-October. The German defenders had acquitted themselves well, but there was another factor that reduced Allied progress to almost nothing. At the end of September, the weather began to turn, and the rains arrived over northern Italy. Within days, mountain paths turned into streams of thick, glutinous mud. Armored and motorized units found it impossible to advance. Artillery shells and other supplies had to be moved to the front by hand, and the result was inevitable. By the end of October, the Allies had failed to exploit their breach of the Gothic line. Despite heavy casualties, the advance of Second Corps petered out just 10 miles short of Bologna. To the east, 8th Army also suffered heavy losses before digging in on a line running through Cesena. As the weather continued to worsen, stalemate had returned to the battlefield, though a drier spell in December saw the 8th Army advance as far as Ravenna. December also saw the Fifth Army see off a desperate attempt at a counterattack ordered by Mussolini, still the nominal ruler of northern Italy. For the men of the 8th Indian Division, Christmas Day was spent holding back Il Duce's last throw of the dice, and for soldiers of both sides, all across the front, Christmas 1944 was a miserable business. There was only one consolation for the Allied men, but it was a massive consolation. 1944 was the year when the inevitability of Hitler's defeat became reality. Between May and November, Germany and her allies were pushed back on every front on which they engaged, and 1944 had seen the Allies in Italy make their contribution to the Axis retreat. But the war was still not over as 1945 dawned. It is difficult to describe the physical hardships faced by the troops stationed in Italy in the early months of 1945. As rain, snow, and miserable cold gripped the battlefield, the conditions on the front line resembled a scene from the First World War rather than the Second. Predictably, low morale was a problem for the Allied soldiers. They knew that their enormous efforts had gone largely unnoticed by an outside world who regarded Italy as little more than a sideshow. A black sense of humor revealed itself in the conversation of the ordinary soldier, who also had to consider changes of senior command as the stalemate continued. General Harold Alexander became Field Marshal Alexander upon his appointment as Supreme Commander in the Mediterranean Theatre, with command of the 15th Army Group passing to Mark Clark, whose 5th Army was taken by General Lucien Truscott. Command of the 8th Army had already been taken by General Richard McCreary when Oliver Leese was moved to Southeast Asia to take charge of Allied land forces there. But it was in March of 1945 that the most significant change of leadership took place. That month, Albert Kesselring finally left Italy to become Commander-in-Chief West, to be replaced by the old commander of 10th Army, General Weitinghoff. On the 1st of April 1945, the long pause in the Italian campaign came to an end as the warmth of spring finally returned. That day, commando units of British 8th Army launched a surprise assault against strategic positions around Lake Comacchio on the right of the front line. It was a brave assault which succeeded in drawing German defences away from the main 8th Army thrust towards Ferrara through a pass of dry land known as the Argenta Gap. The might of Allied air power was now brought to bear as the skies cleared, and by the 14th of April, Allied troops were closing in on Argenta. At that point, the air support switched to a new assault by the 5th Army in the direction of Bologna, the objective that had just eluded them over 5 months before. This time, there was no halt in progress. On the 21st of April, a contingent of Polish troops captured the city, as the German defenders found themselves pushed back towards the line of the River Po, a waterway whose bridges had already received the attentions of Allied bombers. In the days that followed, Weitenhoff and senior German officials in Italy put out feelers to the Allies to discuss terms for surrender. On the 29th of April, a German delegation met Field Marshal Alexander at a meeting near Naples. At the end of that meeting, an agreement was reached for a surrender to come into force on the afternoon of May the 2nd. The campaign in Italy was almost over. The day before that meeting, Mussolini was shot by Italian partisans and his body strung up from the roof of a petrol station in Milan. The day after the surrender agreement, Adolf Hitler died by his own hand to avoid such a humiliation. 2 days later, Hitler's war came to an end in the Italian theatre of operations. It had taken 20 long, hard months to make the journey from Reggio in the deep south to the plains of the Italian north. On the way, the men of the 15th Army Group dealt with some of the toughest fighting conditions endured by any Allied forces in the course of the Second World War. A fearsome landscape, harsh weather, a determined adversary, devastating enemy fire, and dubious decisions by their own commanders were all factors that the Allied soldiers in Italy had to contend with. There was also the lingering question of whether the whole Italian campaign was just a sideshow to more dramatic events elsewhere. But the Allies did secure their victory. In the course of the fighting, they succeeded in tying down vast numbers of German troops who could have been deployed elsewhere. This alone represented a huge contribution to the Allied cause, and the men who came from all over the world to fight in Italy endured their hardships with courage and resolve. In modern times, there is a widespread belief that war can be prosecuted with minimal casualties and a devastating turn of speed. The story of the Italian campaign is a reminder that this is not always the case. Sometimes victory requires time and loss and hardship. But victory is victory, as the Allied soldiers who fought so hard in Italy were able to testify at the end of engagements on one of the most intriguing battlefields of the Second World War. Operation Cobra, the American breakout at Avranches on the 25th of July 1944, lifted the lid off the can in which the Germans sought to confine the Allies after the D-Day landings in Normandy 7 weeks earlier. Until then, the German defence, savage, hard-fought and extremely costly, had managed to hold the line against all Allied attempts to progress very far beyond the beachheads and move on into the rest of France. This was accomplished despite critical shortages of men and material, and the impossible demands of Adolf Hitler, whose basic and only strategy was never retreat, never surrender, and fight to the last man. After several failed attempts made at tremendous cost, the British and Canadians had at last established control over the northern districts by the 10th of July. But the Germans were still holding out in the south and southeast, and Operation Goodwood, the attempt to dislodge them, had failed disastrously on the 18th of July. This failure caused hot controversy within the Allied High Command. There was heavy criticism of General Bernard Montgomery, the British commander of the 21st Army Group, who had initiated Goodwood. US General Omar Bradley believed that Montgomery was going to be sacked. Montgomery remained, but at the height of the arguments, Operation Cobra completely changed the picture. Its success negated all the advantages the Germans still retained in France and made further defence irrelevant. For the Germans, the imperative now was to escape and preserve what they could of their hard-pressed forces for the defence of the fatherland. The situation after the success of Operation Cobra was symptomatic of the Axis war effort as a whole. Neither Germany nor Japan could match the industrial might of the Allies, and their losses, which the Allies could absorb, were slowly strangling their war efforts. After 5 years of a war that had seen their early spectacular victories, both Germans and Japanese were on the run, fighting desperately to prevent the enemy from closing in on their home territories. The Japanese were being chased from one Pacific island to the next and fought with manic desperation. Often they reacted to defeat by committing seppuku, ritual suicide. The finishing line for the Americans' island-hopping campaigns was the islands of Japan themselves, which to the Japanese were sacred soil. For them, the fate of their divine emperor Hirohito was also at stake. But by mid-1944, the noose was tightening fast as the Americans reached Guam in the Mariana Islands in the West Pacific. Guam was about 1,100 miles from the nearest Japanese territory, the Bonin Islands. And the Americans had those vital advantages: command of the air and of the seas. In Europe, the Germans were being assailed in the east and the south as well as the west. By 1944, the Russians had advanced beyond their own borders to force the surrender of Germany's ally Romania and enter the Bulgarian capital, Sofia. In southern Europe, despite the masterly defense put up by Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, the Allies had captured Rome, Rimini and Florence and were pressurizing the Germans' Gothic defense line. Under these immense pressures, Hitler's ideas for staving off disaster had turned bizarre. His vengeance weapons, the V-1 pilotless flying bomb and the V-2 rocket, were the stuff of fantasy science fiction. The vengeance was Hitler's answer to the Allied bombing of Germany, but the notion that the V-weapons might turn the course of the war in Germany's favor was also present. In England, the first V-1, which was powered by a pulse jet engine and carried a 1-ton warhead, fell on London on the 13th of June 1944. The throaty roar of its engine, then the sudden silence as it cut out and the V-1 plunged to earth, was a terrifying moment for everyone who heard it. The V2 liquid-fueled rocket, 46 feet long and weighing 13 tons, was able to fall out of the sky with only a whisper of sound as a last-minute warning that always came too late. The sheer craziness of the V-weapon campaign doubtless played its part in a plot to kill Hitler that had been brewing since 1942. On the 20th of July 1944, a one-armed veteran, Count Klaus Schenk von Stauffenberg, placed a briefcase containing a time bomb beneath a heavy oak map table in a hut at Hitler's Rastenburg headquarters. The bomb blew up at 12:42 hours during a high-level conference, but Adolf Hitler was not among the dead. He had, it seems, been saved by the thickness of the tabletop. The Führer's revenge was terrible. Around 200 people were put on trial and executed. Some of them had been only on the periphery of the plot, but implication was enough. Several high-ranking suspects were obliged to kill themselves, including Erwin Rommel, who was in hospital after suffering a fractured skull when his staff car was strafed on the 17th of July. General Ludwig Beck, former Chief of the General Staff, and Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge, who took over Rommel's command after he was injured. Kluge was sacked within a month for failing to warn Hitler of the bomb plot. Hitler had always entertained deep hatred and jealousy of the Prussian officer class to which von Stauffenberg and other high-ranked conspirators belonged, and came to believe that the entire Wehrmacht was riddled with them. He wasn't wrong either. The German army had been the focus of several plots to assassinate the Führer since before the war. Army officers, for their part, had contempt for Hitler and his fanciful ideas of military strategy, which had already brought disaster and shame on the German army in Russia. Fear, suspicion, and the dread that Hitler's vengeance might fall on anyone at any time was a corrosive factor in the plight of German commanders in France. All the more so when their task was to save what they could of their remaining forces and extricate them from the Allied trap that began to close after Operation Cobra. US General George Smith Patton, Jr. was a hot-headed, egotistical commander, but one whose capacity for aggression made it impossible for General Eisenhower to dismiss him. Patton's behavior gave Eisenhower plenty of opportunity. The incident in Sicily, when he slapped the face of a young soldier suffering from battle fatigue, made Patton notorious. He did it again a week later. Though he apologized, Patton was relegated and spent almost a year kicking his heels before he was given command of the US Third Army in January 1944. But Patton's stern war face and his mask of insensitivity and swaggering self-confidence hid a man of too much emotion and too much self-doubt to justify his own concept of an effective military commander. War, said Patton, is very simple, direct, and ruthless. It takes a simple, direct, and ruthless man to wage war. In this context, Patton's performance as a hard-nosed bully was impeccable. Not surprisingly, he aroused opposing reactions. He was hated and admired in equal measure. The contrast between the pugnacious Patton and the self-effacing General Omar Nelson Bradley could hardly have been more complete. Whereas Patton was always hot news for war correspondents, Bradley's understated style of command afforded little copy. Bradley failed to distinguish himself at West Point, and the first 28 years of his military career were frustrating. His assignments kept him at home in the United States, and he once remarked that he spent the years between the First and Second World Wars apologizing for his lack of combat experience. But those years were far from wasted. As a tutor at West Point, Fort Benning, and Leavenworth Infantry School, Bradley developed his tactical skills and his own sympathetic style for the handling of troops. In 1943, Bradley transferred to the North African Front, where he served as Eisenhower's advisor, and at last saw action when he led the 2nd Corps of Patton's 7th Army in Sicily. The following year, in Normandy, Bradley commanded the 1st Army on D-Day, and later saw them through the long, laborious struggle to overcome German resistance in the Cotentin Peninsula. At last, the war correspondents had something to write about. Noting how greatly Bradley was admired by his troops, the journalists labelled him the Soldiers' General. Field Marshal Gunther Hans von Kluge was one of the elder statesmen among German military commanders in the Second World War. His career had begun as long ago as 1901. Later, Kluge was in command of Army Group Center, which challenged but failed to overcome the Russian defenders of Moscow in the winter of 1941. In July 1944, when Hitler dismissed Field Marshal von Rundstedt, Kluge replaced him as overall commander of the German forces defending France. But by this time, Kluge had realized that Hitler's strategy meant the destruction of the army. Kluge became extremely pessimistic about Germany's chances in the war, but he never discovered if his prognosis was correct. Hitler suspected that he was implicated in the bomb plot of the 20th of July. He was relieved of his command on the 17th of August and ordered back to Germany. 2 days later, while on the way, Kluge killed himself at Metz in northeastern France. Late in June 1944, Colonel General Paul Hauser was given command of the 7th Army, despite the protests of Erwin Rommel. Like Kluge, Hauser came from a long-established military family. He was 64 years old and a convinced Nazi, which Rommel was not. Hauser had seen service in the First World War, but defeat in 1918 left him anxious for a chance to restore Germany's military reputation. Hauser's command of the 7th Army was a poisoned chalice. It was already in a parlous state after a month of desperate defense in Normandy, and in the subsequent retreat through the Falaise-Argentin Gap suffered more losses in men and material. Hauser was one of those who managed to get away, riding to safety on a Panther tank, but he was badly wounded and had to relinquish his command. Hauser, who appeared as a witness for the defense at the Nuremberg trials, was a long-term survivor of the Second World War. He was 92 when he died in 1972. The strategy of the Allies after the breakout from Normandy was complete on the 31st of July 1944 was to converge on the Germans as they attempted to escape from France through the gap between Argentin and Falaise. If the Allies could eliminate the main German armies in France, it would serve as a virtual death blow, removing them from the scene as the Allies advanced towards the German border and invaded the fatherland itself. The Allied forces certainly seemed capable of such a feat. By the 1st of August, the US Third Army had been unveiled, General George Patton commanding. The Third Army formed part of the new US 12th Army Group, commanded by General Omar Bradley, which also included the First Army, led by the taciturn Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges. Patton's force took up position on the right of the Allied line. The British were on the left, comprising the 21st Army Group, which had been expanded to include Lieutenant General Henry Creerer's Canadian First Army. To the Canadians' right was the British Second Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Sir Miles Dempsey. With military power of these proportions against a critically decimated German army, there was talk that the Second World War in Europe could be over before 1944 came to an end. The gap between Argentin and Falaise was the obvious exit from France, and the German 7th and 5th Army, formerly Panzer Group West, headed for it, hoping to elude the Allied pincer movement that was about to build up against them. The best the Germans could do now was somehow fight their way through before the Allies closed the gap. Top German commanders were pessimistic about their prospects, but among the lower ranks, who probably knew less about their real situation, hope was not yet lost. Some faint-hearts had deserted. More than 1,600 were executed in 1944, but others still had faith in the brilliance of their leaders and their own fighting spirit. It was not impossible either that the Germans could count on further mistakes by the Allies, the same mistakes that had already plagued their assaults on Caen. Allied strategy around Caen had proved both faulty and costly, and there was too a strange torpor afflicting some of their units which reduced their battle effectiveness. On paper, therefore, it seemed as if the decimated German defence had little chance. On the ground, the picture was not quite so dark as this might suggest. Even before the D-Day landings in Normandy on the 6th of June 1944, the Allied commanders had come to believe that wherever Allied forces met the Germans in anything like equal strength, the Germans were going to prevail. It followed from this that to triumph in Normandy, the Allies must create the most favourable conditions possible for their forces. These conditions depended in the main on the overwhelming size of the invading armies and the vastly superior numbers of their weapons. In this rather nervous scenario, the Allies would have to swamp their way to success, or not succeed at all. However, by July 1944, the steady, if slow, build-up of Allied capability in France was creating the mammoth military strength the scenario required. Already by the end of June, 875,000 Allied troops, 150,000 vehicles, and 570,000 tons of stores had arrived in Normandy, and replacements exceeded casualties by over 17,000 fresh troops. There was now no question that the Allies and the Germans would meet on the basis of equality, even if Allied dominance of the air were not included in the equation. The American Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, wingspan 103 feet, was a giant among the Allied aircraft of the Second World War. When first introduced in June 1939, the B-17 was the world's most advanced heavy bomber and became the most predominant used by the United States between 1942 and 1945. The 1939 model had to be upgunned several times and fitted with extra armor to become equal to the challenge of the German Luftwaffe. This requirement produced the final Flying Fortress variant, the B-17G, and 8,630 were delivered to the United States Army Air Force in Europe by April 1945, when production ceased. The B-17G Flying Fortress was manned by between 6 and 10 aircrew. Powered by 4 1,200 horsepower Wright Cyclone engines, the bomber could reach a maximum speed of 287 miles an hour and had a ceiling of 35,000 feet. With a full bomb load of 12,800 pounds, the Flying Fortress's range was 1,100 miles. For defense, the bomber carried 13 half-inch machine guns, some of them sighted in the front turret. The flamethrower was one of the horror weapons of the war, capable of engulfing and incinerating an enemy, his position, and everything else within a range of about 50 yards or more. By their very nature, flamethrowers rarely inflicted the sort of light injury that would enable an enemy to continue fighting. Under flamethrower fire, the enemy was more likely to be severely disabled by burns and too agonized to fight back. Initially, flamethrowers served different uses for the British and Americans. The Germans had already used these weapons in their Blitzkrieg campaigns of 1939 and 1940, and the British Expeditionary Force in Western Europe was well aware of their punishing potential. The Americans, on the other hand, realized very early what fanatical enemies the Japanese were in the Pacific, always willing to die rather than surrender, and fighting in a fashion tantamount to suicide. In the Pacific theater, the flamethrower was used against Japanese pillboxes and blockhouses. In this context, the flamethrower was less of a direct fighting weapon, more of a shortcut to avoid the slaughter that would ensue if the Japanese were allowed to deploy their full strength in more conventional warfare. Most flamethrowers used in the Second World War were portable one-man weapons. Their range was, of course, limited, but the recompense was the flamethrower's awesome effectiveness. The British 3-inch mortar and the American 81mm mortar were basically the same thing. The mortar was a fairly simple 3-inch caliber weapon requiring a 3-man team, one to carry the short stubby barrel, another to carry the base plate, the third carrying the bipod, which was adjustable, all in addition to several 3-round ammunition carriers. The mortar, which had a characteristic thud when in action, was percussion fired and had to be reloaded for each shot. After 7 weeks of near-suicidal defense, German military capability in France was on the brink of collapse. By mid-July 1944, the Germans had lost over 96,000 men, but had received only 5,200 to replace them. They'd lost 225 tanks, with only 17 received. Whole regiments had virtually ceased to exist. The remnants of 4 of them made up a battle group within the 2nd Parachute Corps, whose manpower stood at no more than 3,400 riflemen. The elite Panzer-Lehr division was reduced to 40 tanks and just over 2,000 men. This paltry strength was weakened still further after 1,500 bombers of the 8th US Army Air Force bombed the Panzer-Lehr's positions. The raid took place on the 24th of July, in bad visibility, and several bombs fell on American frontline troops. Even so, the Panzer-Lehr was virtually wiped off the face of the battlefield. Almost all its remaining tanks were lost, and barely 700 of its men survived. Essentially, the German 7th Army in France had been reduced to scratch formations, and all they had to back them up were 4 battalions of the 275th Division, all of them weak and hardly capable of holding back the onslaught of the Allies. The Jagdpanther tank destroyer was an amalgam of 2 extremely powerful weapons. The mighty PaK-43 88mm gun was mounted on the basic chassis of a Panther tank, complete with its original powertrain and lower hull. The Jagdpanther, which had an MG-34 machine gun at the front, weighed more than 100,000 pounds and was capable of a maximum 28 miles per hour. Armor was up to 4 inches thick. The Jagdpanther was a late development in German weaponry of the Second World War. It became available only just in time for the Germans to oppose the D-Day landings in June 1944. By that time, the German armaments industry was already so hard-pressed that it could produce only 382 Jagdpanthers before the war came to an end in 1945. But although comparatively few in number, the Jagdpanther had a deadly effect on the Allied armor in Normandy. The Jagdpanther could maneuver with ease across most types of terrain, though the Normandy bocage, with its network of small fields surrounded by thick hedgerows, considerably reduced its effectiveness. But then that applied to all tanks and self-propelled artillery that ventured in this tortuous maze. But in favourable terrain, the Jagdpanther could stand off beyond the reach of most Allied tank guns. Firing from close to 1,100 yards distance, the Jagdpanther was able to destroy Allied tanks virtually at leisure. German hand grenades were mainly designed to kill by exploding on or close to their targets. Unlike Allied grenades, there was only minimal fragmentation, so that hot and deadly fragments were not expelled by the blast when the grenade blew up. The Steyl Handgranat 24, the S-24, was a grenade of this type. It was primed by unscrewing the base and pulling on the detonation cord attached to a wooden stick. It was relatively simple to use and had a particularly effective pin mechanism. The S-24 measured around 16 inches in length. It weighed around 14 ounces and contained just under 6 ounces of explosive. This grenade was an adaptation of the stick hand grenade 23, called the potato masher by the Allied troops. The furtive nature of anti-personnel mines has always made them a much feared weapon, and minefields were extensively sown by the Germans during the Battle of Normandy. When the British and Canadians captured northern Caen, they found it was alive with mines, and the area remained dangerous for some time before they were cleared away. The S-Mine 35 was one of the Germans' smaller mines, 5 inches in height and 4 inches in diameter. Within its hidden casing, the S-35 concealed up to 18 ounces of TNT, with a firing load of 360 steel balls. It could be activated in several ways, either by a pressure trigger, or by tripwires, or by firing it electrically. Before blowing up, the S-35 would jump between 3 and 5 feet into the air by means of a propellant charge. In order to render the S-35 harmless, the tripwires had to be cut and the igniters neutralized. Then the plugs were removed so that the mine could be disarmed by removing the detonator. On the 15th of July 1944, Erwin Rommel warned Hitler that the moment was fast approaching when the hard-pressed German defences would crack. The moment arrived 10 days later, on the 25th of July. Delayed by rain, low cloud and bad visibility, Operation Cobra at last got off the ground, although it stuttered rather than leapt into life with a preliminary raid that hit the American forward positions. Over 100 GIs were killed, and nearly 500 others were injured. Nevertheless, the prestigious Panzer-Lehr division was all but destroyed, and the way was open for a full-scale Allied advance. The raid provoked the customary blaze of artillery from the German defenders, who gave their performance more credit than it was due. When the friendly fire from their own air force made the Americans hastily vacate their positions, the Germans presumed that they were withdrawing in the face of their guns. Meanwhile, there had been another distraction. Another attack was launched on the 25th of July, Operation Spring, a British and Canadian effort against the German forces south of Caen. The Germans responded quickly and forcefully. The 1st and 9th SS Panzer Divisions hit back so hard that within 24 hours the attack had to be called off. Operation Spring was, of course, a sideshow, but the Germans got the impression that it was the main Allied onslaught. This was not surprising, considering the parlous state of their intelligence and their poor communications. But while the Germans were occupied with Spring, Cobra gained unexpected time to get going before they realized their mistake. The delay proved invaluable, clearing the ground of appreciable opposition. On the 25th of July, the US 7th Corps had pushed more than 2 miles into the German positions. On the 26th, US 8th Corps had joined in and the Germans were pushed back a further 4 miles. These successes set up the conditions for the US 2nd Armoured Division, known as the Hell on Wheels Division, to break through into open country on the 27th of July. The next day, the US 7th Corps reached Coutances. By then, the Germans had at last realized what was happening and switched the 2nd and 17th SS Divisions to pose a threat to the Americans' flank. But it was too late. The Germans succeeded in blocking the way into Coutances for a few hours, but by the evening they'd been driven off, and the Americans were in possession. On the 30th of July, General Patton's Third Army seized the important road junction at Avranches and the southern extent of the Cotentin Peninsula. By this time, Allied forces had advanced 37 miles, covering more ground in 6 days than in the whole of the previous 7 weeks. The Normandy countryside that now lay before the Americans was a very welcome sight. At last they were out of the bocage, that obstructive maze where even their Rhino tanks equipped with blades for cutting through the hedgerows, had managed only minimal progress. By the 2nd of August, the Americans were also presented with a sweep of open country 5 miles wide at Avranches, where a gap was being held open for them by Allied air forces and armour. 4 divisions of Patton's Third Army passed through Avranches on the 3rd of August, cleared the bocage, and emerged onto the plains of Normandy. They encountered no serious resistance. The German defences had broken, just as Rommel predicted they would. More than that, the 7th Army was disintegrating into small, scattered battle groups, some no bigger than battalion size. Columns of men were wandering the countryside, looking for a way out. Most of the Germans were short of ammunition, especially for their anti-tank guns. Tanks ran out of fuel and were abandoned by the roadside. The Germans were constantly hammered from the air and sustained enormous casualties. By the 6th of August 1944, they'd lost more than 144,000 men, and replacements, when they managed to get through, numbered less than 20,000. It was a scene of chaos and despair, but as so often happened with the Germans, it was not the whole story. Where they were able to regroup and mount a defence, even where they could mobilise only a few tanks, they could still impede the Allied advance. It seemed impossible that they could turn it back, and the Allies tended to take that for granted. But it was unwise, just as it was 4 months later in the Ardennes, when the Americans were surprised by a last-ditch armoured offensive. The Führer still hoped to transform German fortunes in Normandy with a brilliant last-minute strike, and however pessimistic their own views, his commanders were still duty-bound to try to make Hitler's dreams come true. On the 3rd of August, Hitler ordered a counterattack, Operation Lüttich, to take place at Avranches 3 days later. The purpose of Lüttich was to isolate the US Third Army, turn north and crush the Normandy beachhead. This was, of course, unduly, even criminally ambitious. The Germans had to scrape together the required forces from what remained of 5 panzer divisions. Between them, they had only 185 tanks, and their mobile armoured attack would inevitably attract attention from Allied planes. Erwin Rommel, who knew about such things, would never have approved, but at the time he was out of action and out of favour. He was under suspicion for complicity in the July bomb plot to kill Adolf Hitler. Hitler's acquaintance with military realities had always been shaky, and no one else seriously believed in the success of the counterattack. But it was dangerous to gainsay the Führer. Lüttich went ahead. The German assault would begin at Monte, which had been captured by the US 7th Corps, and the positions to be targeted were those of the 30th US Division. Hitler's purpose was to split the American forces in two, seize control of the road network around Monte, and then drive on to the coast. However, the ultra codebreakers were intercepting the German radio transmissions, and warned the Allied commanders of the German plans. The panzers managed to capture Monte, but it was of no use to them without control of the road junctions to the north, which were blocked by the Americans at l'Abbé Blanche. The strategic Hill 314, sited on the high ground east of Monte, also eluded the Germans. The hill remained in the hands of the US 30th Division, who used it to plaster the Germans with artillery fire. But the Germans were undeterred by difficulties. They kept on attacking Hill 314, and at one point an SS officer presented the Americans with a surrender ultimatum. The Americans declined to accept. This refusal was answered by even more vigorous attacks, in which several American foxholes were overrun. In the bitter fighting that followed, the Americans on Hill 314 had to call on their artillery for rescue. But the sound and fury of the German assaults were hollow, and their successes were short-lived. The Americans sent out tanks to hunt down their infantry, and early on the 7th of August, Allied fighter bombers arrived and pounded them so heavily that half their tanks were destroyed. Next, a 5-mile advance by the panzers into the American lines came to an ignominious end when they ran out of fuel. The German armor took so much punishment that they had only 8 of their 88mm tank guns left. Field Marshal Kluge and Colonel General Hauser were so appalled at the wastage that they dared to protest when Hitler ordered the panzers to remain in position on the 9th of August. As usual, protest proved useless. Hitler issued orders for a further attack on the 11th of August in the direction of Avranches, 20 miles west of Mortain. For this purpose, all available German armor was to be concentrated on a new formation, Panzer Group Eberbach, General Hans Eberbach commanding. The new group comprised the scratchings of those forces that had been able to survive. But the German attack at Mortain had valuable uses for the Allies. The doomed German attack at Mortain fitted very neatly into General Montgomery's plan to envelop and trap the enemy between Argentan and Falaise. The Germans had been ordered not to retreat from Mortain, and this placed them just where Montgomery wanted them. On the 6th of August, Montgomery issued a directive that required the Canadian First Army to attack towards Falaise and then turn east towards the River Seine. Meanwhile, the British Second Army would move towards Argentan and also turn east. The American 12th Army was ordered to continue its eastward advance and then head for Paris. The German counterattack at Mortain and their subsequent failure to retreat while there was still time meant that the whole of their Army Group B, the remnants of the force assigned to defend Normandy, stood between the jaws of Montgomery's trap. The encirclement was amended on the 8th of August when Patton's 15th Corps was ordered to Alenion to cover the southern sector of the trap. 3 days later, the Canadians received new orders to capture both Falaise and Argentan, while the 12th US Army Group completed the entrapment by advancing to Argentan. On paper, it all appeared straightforward, but as so often happened with the Germans, the reality on the ground was different. Instead of enclosing and mopping up a depleted and dispirited enemy, the Allies found themselves fiercely resisted. One of the Germans' great strengths was their ability to switch armor, guns, and men from one place in immediate danger to the next, and to do it quickly. This strategy had succeeded several times already, and now it was going to succeed again. Operation Totalize, the Canadian advance on Falaise, began on the 7th of August, but became bogged down 4 days later. The Canadians' reserves and the 1st Polish Armoured Division were fighting their first battle, and they proved unequal to the task of either capturing Falaise or driving through to Argentan to meet up with the Americans. By the 11th of August, when the Canadians came to a halt, they were only halfway to Falaise after an advance of 9 miles. The American 15th Corps, which included the 2nd French Armoured Division, had little difficulty in reaching Argentan, where they waited impatiently for the Canadians to catch up. The Canadians' next attempt, Operation Tractable, went in on the morning of the 14th of August, and this time they managed to break through to Falaise to take up positions 12 miles north of the Americans. However, valuable time had been lost. Now a huge pocket was formed with the German 7th Army, the 5th Panzer Army and Panzer Group Eberbach inside it. The only exit was at Falaise, and on the 13th of August, in a typically aggressive gesture, General Patton had tried to persuade General Bradley to let him close the gap by driving his 15th Corps north of Argenton. Bradley refused. The Allied line was too thinly stretched for him to risk a German strike against both ends. Bradley preferred to wait until troops of the 1st US Army arrived at Argenton to take over the position of the 15th Corps. Bradley was not alone in his caution. Most of the Allied commanders, except for the fiery Patton, were somewhat awed by German military tactics, which were admittedly superior. This was particularly true when their skills were likely to be exercised in as tight a corner as the Falaise Gap. The Allies also went in dread of inflicting an unacceptable casualty rate on their own forces. Add to that a lack of experience in conducting a large encirclement, and these inhibitions were going to limit the success the Allies were able to achieve at Falaise. There was, of course, no question that the Germans were going to hold the Falaise pocket. The point was how much of their decimated, exhausted army and remaining armour would be able to escape. All the Germans could do before the inevitable collapse was to hold on to every yard of ground. On the 15th of August, a German tank screen brought an advance by Canadian armour to a halt. The 3rd Canadian Division was forced to withdraw from the village of Solanghi by a spirited German counterattack. The 2nd Canadian Division had better luck near Falaise. The Germans pulled back, allowing them to reach positions about a mile away. From there, the Canadians drove into the town, where the last-ditch style of the German defence was once again typified by a handful of Hitler Youth from the 12th SS Panzer Hitlerjugend Division. Outside, there were about 100 men of the Mount Royal Fusiliers with anti-tank guns, mortars and Bren carriers. At the end, the Fusiliers took only 4 prisoners. The rest were all dead. Falaise itself was a sea of ruin and rubble so extensive that it was impossible to make out where the streets had been. Bulldozers set to work clearing up the mess. Several hours passed before bulldozers were able to clear paths for the Canadian vehicles. The previous day, Field Marshal von Kluge informed Army Headquarters that holding the gap at Falaise was impossible. This time, and at long last, Adolf Hitler saw sense and agreed to a retreat. But he dismissed von Kluge, whom he suspected not only of complicity in the July bomb plot, but of negotiating with the Allies behind his back. Von Kluge was replaced by Field Marshal Walter Model, who found himself in charge not of an army, but of a rabble avid to get away from the killing fields of Normandy. Time for escape was now running very short. On the 17th of August, the 2nd Canadian Corps and the US 5th Corps made advances that reduced the exit from the Falaise pocket to just a few thousand yards. The Germans fought desperately to prevent it shrinking further. At the village of Saint-Lambert on the 19th of August, Canadian infantry duelled all morning with the German defenders, who forced them to dig in. The Germans mounted successive counterattacks, so the Canadians would not prevent them keeping open the route for their escape eastwards. The Germans were being helped from an unusual quarter. Elsewhere, the advance by Canadian and Polish troops was agonizingly, inexplicably slow, despite frantic urgings from Montgomery and Lieutenant General Guy Simonds, commander of the Canadian Second Corps. The Allied air forces hammered the German infantry, and tanks now pouring through the still open gap. Allied fighter bombers flew up to 3,000 sorties a day, and the slaughter and destruction were immense. But still, the Falaise gap remained open, and still the fleeing Germans surged through, despite the deadly gauntlet they had to run. The Poles had seized the high ground at Monte and set up machine gun positions from which they blasted down fire on the Germans passing below. They called up artillery to pound columns of German vehicles as they drove by. The Canadians, meanwhile, fired at every group of Germans they could see. The Germans were scattered, running in ones and twos from the shelter of one wood to the next. Some were picked off quickly. Some fell to the ground but managed to run on. Some lay injured, unable to continue. Some simply gave up and hoisted white flags. But by then, the ground was littered with corpses and the hulks of smoking, ruined tanks and vehicles. The gap between Argentan and Falaise was finally closed on the 21st of August, when the Canadians and the Poles linked up at Coudard. The 3rd and 4th Canadian Division managed to capture Saint-Lambert after 2 days of ferocious combat, and the US 90th Division secured Chambouat. 4 days later, Paris was liberated by the 2nd French Armoured Division. All of it should have happened earlier, and the reasons why it didn't have been subject to dispute ever since. The nature of the fighting in Normandy between the 25th of July and the 21st of August 1944 seemed inexplicable. The German forces were in a state of collapse. They were outnumbered and outgunned. They had no air cover and were constantly hammered by the Allied air forces. Their intelligence was poor and their communications were faulty. Adolf Hitler, their supreme commander, issued orders no responsible military man would ever have contemplated. By rights, the Allies should have been able to flick away their resistance and surge on into Germany with little or no difficulty. Yet it did not happen. How was this possible? The depressing fact was that in all the essentials of war, the German forces were superior. When it came to tactics, German commanders were more skilled and more adept at making the most of their resources. Their men were better motivated, better led, better trained, much more determined, and far more willing to sacrifice themselves for their cause. Among the Allied forces, only the Russians displayed the same urge to fight to the death. By the time the battle for Normandy ended at Falaise, the Germans were being hunted down all over France. The remnants of the German 7th Army were in full retreat, heading for the bridges across the River Seine. Following the invasion of southern France on the 15th of August, the German 9th Army was withdrawing in disorder up the valley of the River Rhône. In a bold, pattern-style initiative, troops of the American 6th Corps under General Lucien Truscott managed to overtake the Germans and trap them at Montélimar on the east bank of the Rhône on the 22nd of August. But Truscott was thwarted 6 days later. The 2nd Panzers counterattacked and did better than their counterparts at Falaise. They kept the escape route open long enough for most of the German forces to get away. However, they did leave behind 15,000 prisoners, and some 4,000 of their tanks and other vehicles were destroyed. This, though, was not an escape to safety. The French resistance, avid for revenge after 4 years of brutal occupation, sought and savoured every opportunity to kill, torture, or mutilate all the Boche they could find. Whole units of German soldiers wandered around looking for Allied troops to whom they could surrender. Only the haven of captivity could protect them from the fury of the French. Meanwhile, in the west, far from any chances of getting out of France, isolated German garrisons held out at Brest, Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, La Rochelle, and in the estuary of the Gironde. Brest surrendered after a long siege on the 18th of September 1944, and the rest a few months later, except for Lorient, which remained in German hands until the end of the war. The garrisons had stayed in place on Hitler's orders, but it was a futile gesture. They were nothing but specks left over from a once mighty force that had overrun and occupied France since 1940, and the zest of that triumph had long since faded. The major pursuit, of course, was in northeastern France, where the Allies were chasing their quarry towards the West Wall, the fortifications popularly known as the Siegfried Line that protected the western border of Germany. The British and Americans were still in pursuit well into September, but this was creating its own problems. The further the Allied forces were from the Normandy coast, the longer their supply lines became, and a fresh campaign would be needed to shift the Germans from more convenient ports on the Belgian coast. Meanwhile, the German forces that managed to elude the Allies' clutches had a chance to dig themselves in behind the West Wall. The fortifications, popularly known as the Siegfried Line, were 3 miles deep and had been built after 1938 to protect the western border of Germany. In 1944, reserves were rushed to the West Wall as the survivors of Normandy dug themselves in. They were in a similar state to the wall itself, battered, dilapidated, feeble. But their discipline and their will to fight was still intact, and their leadership, headed by Field Marshal von Rundstedt, was of high quality. If Normandy were anything to go by, the Allies were in for yet another costly struggle, and the war was still a long way from its end. In early September 1944, when the Allied forces were approaching the West Wall, 14 weeks had passed since the D-Day landings in Normandy. The West Wall, the fortifications protecting Germany's western border, lay 300 miles inland from the Normandy beaches. But that was not the only way the distance could be calculated. It was also measured in slog and slaughter, hardship and destruction, trauma and exhaustion. After the D-Day landings in Normandy, hundreds of thousands of men had been killed on both sides, scores of them at a time, to gain, then often lose, just a few yards of ground. Thousands of acres of countryside were laid waste and littered with the burned-out wrecks of tanks, guns and vehicles. Towns and villages were left a mess of smoking ruins. Eventually, German forces fleeing from the Battle of Normandy had been trapped in the Falaise Argentin pocket. Those who managed to escape were pursued all the way to the German border. The Germans fled in disarray, often in panic, but anyone who believed that they were finished was very much mistaken. Once they reached the safety of the West Wall, the Germans took on a new guise, no longer an exhausted enemy on the run, but defenders encased in fortifications of concrete and steel, which they believed to be impregnable. Originally, the West Wall, begun in 1938, had been Germany's answer to the Maginot Line, which protected eastern France from attack across the Rhine. The two fortifications faced each other across a short stretch of territory in the Saar region of southwest Germany, but the value of the West Wall at that time was diplomatic rather than military. Adolf Hitler found it very useful as a frightener. The West Wall, later known to the Allies as the Siegfried Line, helped the Führer scare the governments of Britain and France into making concessions, so feeding their policy of appeasement. It was March 1939 when Germany invaded Czechoslovakia before the British and the French at last woke up to reality. By then, the Second World War was only 6 months away. After the German conquest of France in 1940, the West Wall became irrelevant. Its machine guns and cannon were removed and sent to the Atlantic Wall, and the fortifications fell into disrepair. Even the D-Day landings in June 1944 failed to prompt the Germans to make efforts at getting the wall into better shape. It was not until the following August, when they'd already lost the Battle of Normandy, that the Germans began to think the unthinkable. The fatherland itself might soon be invaded. The potential of the West Wall could no longer be ignored. On Hitler's orders, some 360,000 civilians and boys from the Hitler Youth were set to work repairing and rearming the dilapidated defense line. Considering the short time available, this scratch workforce achieved wonders. When they'd finished, some parts of the West Wall remained weak, but others had been greatly strengthened. And even in this state, the wall was still a formidable barrier. The fortifications formed a band of natural and artificial defences up to 5 miles deep, stretching some 400 miles from the southwest corner of the Netherlands to the Swiss border. The West Wall featured around 22,000 pillboxes, troop shelters and command posts, all interlinked and all mutually supportive. In some places, such as the rivers Rhine, Ruhr and Kiel, the terrain provided natural obstacles to invasion. Where the lie of the land failed to oblige, concrete pyramids called dragon's teeth were planted in parallel rows to obstruct attackers. Nazi propaganda, of course, touted the West Wall as impregnable. Its real purpose was not to repulse assaults, but to hold up the enemy long enough for mobile reserves to arrive and stage counterattacks. Even so, for the Allies in 1944, the difference was academic. The reality of the West Wall matched the propaganda for a very long time. Only about 12% of the German 7th Army, or rather its decimated remnants, had managed to escape from the Falaise-Argentan Gap in August 1944. But before long, these remnants had formed up along the West Wall and were soon being joined by reinforcements. The German High Command had given the western defences priority, and units were transferred from the Italian front and the garrisons in Norway and Denmark. They were also removed from the Eastern Front, even though the Russians were fast approaching the Prussian border and were about to break into Germany. Nothing underlined the emergency at the West Wall more than this. For the Germans, the Russians were the most terrifying of all enemies, and civilians awaited their arrival with dread. Nevertheless, the defence against them in the east was salted for manpower, which was rushed across Germany to face the imminent danger in the west. When all were in place, the West Wall and its adjacent areas were being defended as far as the River Mosel by Army Group B under Field Marshal Walter Model, and as far as Karlsruhe by Army Group G under General Hermann Balck. The rest of the fortifications down to the border with Switzerland was defended by SS troops under their chief, Heinrich Himmler. The enormous losses the Germans had already suffered by 1944 meant that they were unable to build up the West Wall garrison to the size its designers had envisaged. However, the problems facing the Allies gave them the chance to make the best of what they had. Exhaustion after the long chase from Falaise was only one of these problems. The Allies' other difficulties were much more fundamental. The Allied forces were suffering the usual fate of modern mechanized armies that advance too fast and too far for their support elements to keep pace with them. Their lines of supply were overstretched, and petrol and ammunition were running low. The Allied air forces and other support units were unable to extend their activities with the same speed. The Americans had no prior experience of assaulting heavy fortifications, and the lessons learned in military training proved to be of little practical use. The terrain had changed, too. Unlike the plains of Normandy, the hills and valleys of the Lorraine area around the West Wall had few roads for tanks and armoured vehicles, and in places featured dense woodland that was hard to penetrate and very difficult to fight in. The most immediate problem, however, was the shortage of fuel. It was so serious that General Patton's Third Army was brought to a halt with empty fuel tanks at the River Meuse on the 30th of August. Patton wanted to move on. He was convinced that his forces could be through the wall and at large inside Germany within 10 days. But to Patton's fury, General Eisenhower allocated what little fuel there was to his hated rival, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, for an advance into Belgium and the Netherlands by the British 21st Army Group. This offensive had two prime purposes. First, to facilitate the capture of Antwerp, a much nearer port than those in Normandy, so the Allies would be able to shorten their critically extended supply lines. Secondly, if Germany could be invaded from the north through the Low Countries, it might shorten the war and save millions of casualties. This, in fact, had been the Allies' chosen strategy when the invasion of Germany was being planned before D-Day. Montgomery's offensive proved to be a tragic disaster. Antwerp was captured on the 4th of September, but German resistance was very much stronger than expected. The Germans blocked the Scheldt estuary, making Antwerp useless for Allied purposes. By the 26th of September, the Allied airdrops at Arnhem had failed at a cost of 7,000 killed, wounded, or captured. General Eisenhower had assumed direct command of ground operations from a very resentful Montgomery on the 3rd of September, and now he was back to square one. After Arnhem, the German defences were still intact, and assaulting the West Wall the hard way, head-on, was the only remaining option. It was not a welcome prospect. Autumn was fast approaching, and with it the chance of torrential rains, mud, cold, overcast skies, and all their attendant miseries. The Allies were in for a very long haul. Field Marshal von Rundstedt, a Prussian aristocrat of the traditional military school, was not entirely trusted by Hitler, who hated his caste out of hand. Rundstedt, for his part, had contempt for both the Führer and the Nazi creed. Despite this mutual disdain, von Rundstedt kept well away from the plots to murder Hitler that occupied his fellow officers. Hitler, for his part, realized that he could not afford to waste von Rundstedt's experience and professionalism, especially after several leading officers had been removed for their involvement in the bomb plot designed to kill the Führer in July 1944. Von Rundstedt had fought in the First World War, where he distinguished himself in the Alsace campaign, and later on both the Eastern and the Western fronts. In the Second World War, he directed operations in France in 1940 and in Russia the following year, and was Supreme Commander of the German forces in Normandy at the time of the D-Day landings. Dismissed for daring to suggest that Hitler make peace, the third time in his career he'd been removed from duty, von Rundstedt was recalled 2 months later, on the 5th of September 1944, to lead the German defense of the West Wall. He remained on active service for the next 6 months until Germany was on the brink of defeat, and retired on the 13th of March 1945, just as the Battle of the West Wall was coming to its end. After the German surrender, there was talk that von Rundstedt should be put on trial at Nuremberg, but he was regarded more as a professional soldier who had done his duty, rather than a war criminal who had abused his position. Geert von Rundstedt died in 1953 at the age of 78. Field Marshal Walter Model was the complete opposite of von Rundstedt. Model shared Hitler's dislike of the Prussian military caste to which von Rundstedt belonged, and his loyalty to the Führer never wavered. In 1944, after Hitler survived the bomb plot to kill him, Model was the first commander on the Eastern Front to send him a telegram reaffirming his allegiance. Rough, aggressive and outspoken, Model's loyalty earned him an advantage not given to many other officers in the Wehrmacht. He was able to ignore the Führer's more impossible orders, act first and receive permission afterwards, and voice some very unpalatable truths. When Model took over from the disgraced Hans-Günther von Kluge as commander of Army Group B in Normandy, the first thing he did was tell Hitler that defeat in France was inevitable. Other high-ranking officers had been dismissed for less. Model's fighting experience in the war was considerable. He served in Poland and commanded the 3rd Panzer Division in Russia, as well as taking charge in Normandy in August 1944. He became known as Hitler's fireman for his skill in shoring up broken fighting fronts. His luck inevitably ran out at the West Wall. Model directed a ferocious defense of the Moselle section assigned to his Army Group B, but in the end he was forced to yield to the massive Allied onslaughts. In April 1945, Model's Army Group B was surrounded in the Ruhr pocket. Rather than accept defeat, he dissolved his forces and gave them the choice of going home, fighting on with other units, or surrendering. Model had always despised Field Marshal von Paulus for capitulating at Stalingrad in 1943 and had no intention of emulating him. Instead, he shot himself on the 21st of April 1945 because he had said a field marshal did not surrender. What is there left, he once asked, to a commander in defeat? Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges was taciturn and uncommunicative. He shunned the limelight to such an extent that General Eisenhower despaired of obtaining for him the recognition he deserved as commander of the US First Army. It was possibly part of a campaign by Eisenhower to heighten Hodges' profile that his troops became the first of the Allied forces to cross the Rhine in 1945. During the interwar years, Hodges was spotted as a promising prospect by General George C. Marshall, future Chief of Staff in the Second World War, who brought him to Washington as Chief of Infantry. Early in 1944, Hodges was in England as deputy to General Omar Bradley during the planning of the D-Day landings. On the 1st of August, Hodges inherited Bradley's command as leader of the First Army. Hodges retired soon after the war as a 4-star general, and he died in 1966. With his understated manner and aversion to publicity, Hodges was one of the quiet men of the American High Command, rarely raising his voice to get things done. Unfortunately, he struck the lower ranks as cold and colourless, and had nothing like the flamboyant Patton's popular appeal. Bradley, however, appreciated Hodges' qualities, especially his insistence on detailed planning, and once said that he had implicit faith in Hodges' judgment, skill, and restraint. During the Second World War, US infantry units received close-fit support from mortars, which they called pocket artillery. The largest mortar in use at this time was the 4.2-inch chemical mortar, which weighed 330 pounds and could fire up to 20 rounds per minute, though only for short periods. Initially, the function of the chemical mortar was to provide smoke, gas, toxic agents, or incendiaries in support of infantry operations. Then, late in 1942, the 4.2-inch mortar was fitted with a high explosive capability, which greatly increased its usage for the 18 battalions that used it in the European theatre. Experiments to lengthen the range of the 4.2-inch mortar were overtaken by the end of the war in Europe, but a month later, in June 1945, tests showed that the weapon was now able to fire over distances of up to 5,600 yards. Development continued until 1951, by which time the chemical mortar had won its spurs as a legitimate infantry weapon. The pillboxes of the West Wall were strong points, arsenals and underground shelters combined. The reinforced concrete roofs were up to 7.5 feet thick, and the walls were more than 6.5 feet thick. The roof rested on steel beams up to a foot thick, and there were two 1.1-inch steel doors. The regular pillboxes of the West Wall were interspersed with larger, multi-story structures, like the Cat's Head armoured fort near the village of Irel in the South Eiffel.
Tragstühle verbinden die verschiedenen Stockwerke.
Its foundations were dug to a depth of 118 feet, and the fort contained 3 stories with reversible turret cannon, automatic flamethrowers and machine guns. The rooms were air-conditioned, providing plenty of comfort for its 84-man crew, who could remain at the Cat's Head for 6 weeks at a time. The typical West Wall pillbox was more compact. There were 2 entrances with a large gas-proof chamber between them. On the right, a short staircase led up to the arms room, with an ammunition bunker attached, and another 37 feet square beyond that. A second arms room, nearly 99 feet square, was sited at the rear. The approaches to the pillbox were protected by minefields, booby traps and barbed wire. The remainder of the accommodation consisted of troop quarters. The first of them was 190 feet square, and the second, measuring 81 feet square, had a locker attached. These pillboxes were like miniature fortresses in their own right, and in March 1945, one of them managed to hold up a division 15,000 strong for several hours. Explosive charges laid against the steel door blew a few holes, but the door failed to yield. It was only when grenades were tossed inside through the holes in the door that the stubborn strongpoint was finally overcome. Colonel Charles Buck Lanham was commander of the 22nd Regiment, the 4th Division of General Patton's 3rd Army, stationed in the Eifel Plateau region of western Germany. On the 13th of September 1944, Lanham informed his battalion officers of a plan for assaulting the West Wall that was simple, straightforward, and, he felt confident, was going to work. 3 battalions would attack the West Wall pillboxes, sited on the Black Man, the heights above the hamlet of Boucher, then move on to the pillboxes at the small village of Brandschied. The 3rd Battalion was to go in first, break through the wall, and open the way for 2 further battalions to follow and complete the attack. After that, the entire 4th Division could surge through the wall and head for the Rhine. The 3rd Battalion, led by Lieutenant Colonel Teague, advanced towards the Black Man Heights, carefully using the terrain to keep out of sight of the West Wall defenders. Some of the Americans were carrying flamethrowers. Meanwhile, American artillery was blasting the German positions. At first, there was no reaction from the West Wall. The Germans were evidently waiting for the right moment. When it came, it was devastating. Mortar fire plunged down on the 3rd Battalion, and the Germans' MG-42s began to clatter out streams of bullets. Americans keeled over, one after the other, until they lay in a pattern of patches on the hillside. Before long, the wounded were being dragged down the hill and back to the regiment's positions. All around, the cry went up for the medics. At length, Colonel Lanham realized that his men were on the brink of losing the battle. He drew his pistol and fired a couple of shots in the air, yelling at his reserves to get up and go. Eventually, they went, picking their way around the bodies still lying on the slopes. Lanham's plan proceeded, despite the ferocity of the German fightback. The 3rd Battalion moved south to Brandscheid, but it was no sleepy little village. Unknown to Lanham or Teague, the place was spiked all around with pillboxes. A tough German battle group, Kampfgruppe Körner, was there, together with SS troops, to dismiss the American efforts with a furore of fire. Teague decided to dig in and try again the next day. The 3rd Battalion went on trying for another 2 weeks, but they got nowhere. The 22nd Regiment, meanwhile, attempted another approach, reducing the German bunkers one by one. This was no small enterprise, and at first the Americans tried to get the Germans to surrender. When they refused, tank destroyers were driven up to the steel doors and blasted them in at point-blank range. It was a dangerous maneuver for the attackers, but it worked. The survivors emerged, most of them badly injured. The dead were piled up inside. Before long, American casualties had mounted to 800 men, some of them killed when the Germans launched a counterattack out of their pillboxes. Half of the 1st Battalion were killed or injured, and only 2 of their officers survived. Many casualties were physically uninjured, but developed combat fatigue. Eventually, Colonel Lanham was forced to call off the attack as the weather worsened and the German defences showed no signs of lessening. Nothing had been gained, and the vital roads leading out of the Eifel region to the Rhine remained under German control. The wall remained intact. The next attempt at the West Wall was made from the Duchy of Luxembourg by the US 28th Infantry Bloody Bucket Division belonging to Courtney Hodges' First Army. The division's reputation for record casualties was furthered at the West Wall, where they were facing a crack force, the 2nd SS Division. As the Americans advanced across the minefields, the Germans saturated the battlefield with mortar and machine gun fire. Within a week, American casualties had reached 1,500 killed and injured. One entire company, F Company, disappeared so completely that no trace was ever found of them. Despite this fearsome defense, the Bloody Bucket Division pushed forward on a narrow front and captured several high points. But these were of little use to them when the 2nd SS Division still held the low ground. Even so, on the 16th of September, the Bloody Bucket scored a notable first. In what the official history described as a pencil-like penetration, they had breached the West Wall. In practical terms, it meant little. The disappearance of F Company had taken the heart out of the Americans' efforts, and they were ordered to wind up operations. A further attempt at the West Wall, made soon afterwards by the 5th Armoured Victory Division, managed to get through the fortifications to a position 6 miles inside German territory. But this initiative led to a mammoth German counterattack, overseen by Field Marshal von Rundstedt himself. Outnumbered, assaulted on both flanks by German infantry and armour, denied air cover when the weather turned nasty, the Victory Division began to falter. On the 19th and 20th of September, they were ordered to pull back. Pencil-thin penetrations were of no interest to General George Patton, commander of the Third Army. As he told newspaper reporters, "I'm going to go through the wall like shit through a goose." By the 5th of September, Patton's enforced halt at the River Meuse came to an end, as supplies of fuel to the Third Army began to flow again. Patton ordered the 12th and 20th Corps to seize the city of Nancy, the capital of Lorraine, as a prelude to breaking through the West Wall and crossing the Rhine. Patton envisaged no serious difficulty. The section of the West Wall immediately facing the Third Army was manned by 7 weak infantry divisions and a panzer brigade of the German First Army. Also in the vicinity were 7 under-strength divisions of the German 19th Army. Hardly an impressive opposition. However, even with this poor showing, this was one of the best defended parts of the West Wall, and Field Marshal Mördl, Hitler's fireman, was in overall charge. Elements of the Third Army set out for the Moselle River close to Nancy on the 11th of September. The Americans crossed the river, and though there was some heavy German resistance, it did not seriously impede their progress. Nancy was duly occupied on the 15th of September. At this juncture, the Americans had to halt for 4 days through lack of supplies and provisions, and the onset of bad weather. The delay gave the Germans the opportunity to regroup and concentrate reserves from their First Army at Château Salins, where they blocked one of the main routes to the Rhine. This meant the Americans had lost the initiative, and the 5th Panzer Army hit them with a series of major strikes at Patton's 4th Armoured Division. The contest continued for 10 days and took on a regular pattern. The Germans attacked under cover of fog and fought a series of vigorous engagements with the Americans. The Americans, who were aided, weather permitting, by aircraft of the 18th Tactical Air Command, outmaneuvered the panzers and forced them to withdraw. Finally, wrecked panzers littered the battle area, and the Germans were down to only 25 tanks. Wisely, they withdrew. In all, they'd lost around 280 tanks and suffered 3,000 casualties, with the same number taken prisoner. American losses were fewer, 626 casualties. But almost non-stop fighting over the past 2 months had exhausted them. They were retired from the Lorraine area on the 12th of October to rest, recoup, and refit. The West Wall remained untouched. Nine days later, to his chagrin, Patton lost the honor of making the first permanent breach in the fortifications. It happened at Aachen, a historic city on the German border with Belgium and the Netherlands. Aachen was fortified, but its defenses were not unusually strong, and though it formed part of the West Wall, its position was of no strategic significance. Nevertheless, the capture of Aachen, the first appreciable city the Allies had encountered on German soil, could prove an important boost to morale. Dealing with Aachen fell to Courtney Hodges' First Army. Hodges' plan was to break through the West Wall north and south of the city, surround and neutralize it, while the bulk of his forces pushed on eastwards towards the Rhine. However, German resistance was so ferocious that it became impossible for the First Army to perform these two tasks at once. Hodges had to choose, and he chose to assault Aachen. The units originally intended for the Rhine were to play a backup role and prevent the Germans from relieving the city. Adolf Hitler fully realized the importance of Aachen and issued his usual orders to the 5,000 Germans defending it. Fight to the last man, never retreat, and die if necessary. The casualties that resulted from such fanatical defense had already proved so high that Hodges attempted to cut short the proceedings. He issued a surrender ultimatum on the 10th of October. As he no doubt expected, it was refused. Hodges now ordered his forces to attack. They were to demarcate the battle area by artillery and mortar fire, dominate the main thoroughfares and intersections with machine guns, and move infantry, tanks, and tank destroyers along the side streets. All the while, they would maintain maximum fire to ensure that no German could escape. While the defenders were being held in thrall in this fashion, buildings would be collapsing all around them, and it would bury them in the ruins. The initial bombardment of Aachen was delivered by 12 artillery battalions, which plastered the city with 10,000 rounds in 2 days. Meanwhile, fighter bombers of the 9th Tactical Artillery Command dropped over 160 tons of bombs on the target in the same period. By noon, heavy fighting was taking place inside Aachen. Nevertheless, by the end of the day, the Americans were ready to blast their way through to the city center. It was not that easy. For the next week, Aachen saw a ferocious struggle as the American tanks and tank destroyers hammered away with heavy caliber fire, using the powerful 155mm artillery pieces to blow entire buildings apart. The 155mm worked on the Germans like a terror weapon. Later, the German commander in Aachen, Colonel Gerhard Wilk, condemned it as barbarous and called for it to be banned. Lieutenant Colonel Darrell Daniel, commander of the 2nd Battalion, had quite another description for the 155mm, quite spectacular and satisfying. By the afternoon of the 21st of October, Daniel's 2nd Battalion had secured the business areas of Aachen and were pushing westwards when they learned the fight was over. Contrary to Hitler's orders, the garrison of Aachen had surrendered. The Americans captured 1,000 prisoners. According to their own reports, the Germans had suffered around 5,000 casualties. Quite probably, a lot more men were killed. The Americans lost around 1/10 of that number, most of them among the assault troops. After the battle, only around 20% of Aachen's buildings were left standing. Even before the capture of Aachen, the 9th Infantry Division of Hodge's 1st Army was ordered into the Hürten Forest, southeast of the city, to clear it as security for the right flank of another effort against the West Wall, a major assault across open country aimed at penetrating the fortifications. The Hürten was a man-made forest around 200 square miles. There were few roads. It was difficult fighting country, certainly for tanks and armored vehicles, and the Americans expected only light resistance. They were wrong. Although the German 7th Army was not well prepared to defend the forest, once the Americans entered, they fought with their customary ferocity to keep them back. By October, the 9th Airborne Division had suffered 4,500 casualties for an advance of less than 2 miles. The battle in the forest now took on the proportions of a major struggle, and one in which the Germans always seemed to be one jump ahead. In November, Hodges ordered the 28th Bloody Bucket Infantry Division to advance through the forest to seize the high ground at Schmidt. Schmidt lay north of the important dams on the River Ruhr. Rain and fog intervened to cause delays, giving the Germans time to target the invasion. During the subsequent fighting, the Americans lost 6,000 casualties in one of the most costly actions of any they fought in the war. An action initially intended to be an easy ride had quickly turned into a nightmare. The forest floor was thickly sown with anti-personnel mines. Shells bursting high in the treetops fell down in showers of deadly metal fragments onto soldiers picking their way through a mess of broken branches and slippery leaves. As the winter wore on, there was rain, mud, sleet, and snow. It was all too easy to get lost in the tangle of trees and stumble into ambushes. The German defense, ferocious as always, had an extra specific purpose. The top-secret Watch on the Rhine, the deliberately misnamed offensive due to take place in the Ardennes in December, could have been jeopardized if the Americans managed to cross the River Ruhr, which ran through the forest. The Ruhr itself was of great importance to the Germans. If the Americans crossed the river, now or in the future, they could be isolated by floods caused by opening the Ruhr dams. Ideally, the flooding might prevent them crossing at all. The cost on both sides was very high. By mid-October, the Germans had lost around 2,000 killed and injured, and 1,200 taken prisoners. American losses were even greater, 4,500 men killed, wounded, or missing. November 1944 went on as September and October had begun. Massive American assaults, accompanied by fighter-bomber attacks, did nothing to break down the German resistance, which was so powerful that the Bloody Bucket Division lost 40% of its strength in 7 days. On the 15th of November, 1,200 flying fortresses of the US Army 8th Air Force flew from the Netherlands to soften up the enemy for the US 84th Division at Geilenkirchen, north of Aachen. But the result was the same, a fearful battle of attrition in which the infantry suffered so many losses they were unable to continue. By December 1944, the Americans had been dashing themselves against the West Wall for 3 months, and despite the victory at Aachen, they were getting nowhere. The Hürten Forest became a microcosm of this failure. After the Bloody Bucket Division was withdrawn, another armoured division and 4 more infantry divisions were sent in, only to be shredded in their turn. None of them lasted more than 2 weeks before they were replaced by the next. The ultimate responsibility for breaking this impasse lay with General Eisenhower. After such a long time, so many losses and so many failures, he might well have felt that his job was on the line. Even worse, the outcome of the war could be in the balance. Inside their defences, the Germans had proved too strong to shift. Instead, Eisenhower sought to lure them out of their fortifications so the Americans could meet them on open ground, where they had a better chance to prevail. Eisenhower laid a trap, the so-called Ghost Front in the Ardennes, where the American defences were thin and the Germans might fancy their chances of success. In fact, Eisenhower had 14 armoured divisions waiting in the wings to fall on them once they emerged. In the meantime, the frontal attacks on the wall continued. There was no major breakthrough, but there were some gains. The Americans captured the important crossroads leading to the defences in the Hürten Forest and the Wallerscheid crossroads north of Monschau. The west wall itself was penetrated to a depth of 1,200 yards. On the 16th of December 1944, the Germans appeared to fall for Eisenhower's trap. They came out of their fortifications, but not to assault the Americans with their understrength manpower. In one of the worst cases of bad luck coincidence in military history, Eisenhower's trap was preempted by the Ardennes offensive, the last gasp initiative by 24 German divisions to throw back the Allies and possibly win the war. The Allies never imagined that at this late stage in the war the Germans were capable of mustering such a force. But the Ardennes offensive did not last long. After initial successes, fuel supplies ran out, and in early January 1945, it was all over. On the 16th of January 1945, 8 days after the end of the Ardennes offensive, British forces under Bernard Montgomery, now a field marshal, took their turn at cracking the West Wall. Their target was the Heinsberg salient, around 20 miles long, which was defended by 3 lines of fortifications, continuous trenches and weapons pits covered by barbed wire and liberally sown with mines. The Germans had 2 infantry divisions in the salient, with 156 guns and 18 assault guns, all of them spread over muddy terrain that was difficult and dangerous to traverse. Montgomery's forces consisted of 2 infantry divisions, the 43rd and the 52nd Lowland Division, and the very tough, very hardy 1st Commando Brigade. US General Patton was not at all happy about the prospect of Montgomery, his hated rival, gaining the honor of being the first to reach the Rhine. At the end of January 1945, Patton, with help from General Bradley, persuaded Eisenhower to agree to an armored reconnaissance in the Eifel region that would take his forces across the rivers Our and Sauer to close in on the West Wall. The term armored reconnaissance was somewhat vague, and Patton preferred it that way. For him, it was a means to an end. Patton wasn't planning a reconnaissance at all. He aimed to get his Third Army so committed to the battle at the West Wall that Eisenhower would have to agree to their participation. The guns of Patton's Third Army opened up on the morning of the 29th of January 1945 and began pounding the fortifications. The weather was foul. It began to snow as the assault battalion of the 4th Infantry began to advance. They slid across the frozen Our River and then blasted their way through Brandscheid with artillery, tank fire, and flamethrowers. The Germans fought back, but in the ferocious hand-to-hand fighting that ensued, they were pushed back. Although they managed to win back the village of Brandscheid, there'd been a partial breakthrough of the West Wall near the town of Prüm. By this time, Patton had expected confirmation from Eisenhower to proceed towards Mosul, When contact was eventually made, Patton was infuriated to be told that the Third Army must stay put, go on the defensive, and await further orders. Orders, when they came through, were not of much comfort to Patton. The hated Montgomery had received sanction for 14 British divisions to begin a fresh attack against the northern positions on the West Wall, starting on the 10th of February. All Patton was allowed to do was continue operations in the Eifel region until that date. After Montgomery's attack went in, Patton turned to making preparations for a separate assault by his Third Army on the center of the West Wall. But attempts at preserving the element of surprise suffered setbacks. The Germans suspected that something big was afoot, and they were certain of it when the Third Army suddenly imposed radio silence. At 0100 hours on the 7th of February 1945, Patton's artillery, including 155mm guns, began roaring out shells towards the German positions across the River Sauer. Under cover of this bombardment, men of the Third Army's 12th Corps set out across the river in 36 rubber boats, formerly belonging to the German Luftwaffe. They ran into a massive blast of German fire, which only one of the boats survived. But a sufficient number of Americans managed to reach the other side of the river to form up and mount attacks on the West Wall pillboxes. This time, the Americans attacked them from the rear, the only way of tackling them that offered a real chance of success. The result was a series of blackened, blasted back doors, and crews so shocked at the suddenness of the onslaught that many of them panicked and surrendered. For the next week, the Americans continued destroying pillboxes, 40 of them to each square mile. But the breaching of the West Wall in the Eifel region was only a local success. The fortifications running from Trier on the Mosel down to the Swiss border were still intact. Patton, unwilling to lose the momentum, wanted to continue his attack, cross the River Mosel and assault Trier, then drive on through to the Rhine. The Third Army did, in fact, capture Trier on the 1st of March, after a very stiff fight lasting 3 days. But the rest of Patton's plan did not accord with official strategy. Montgomery's assault in the Reichswald forest still had priority. Unfortunately, his campaign had degenerated into a grim slogging match. Although his British and Canadian forces had succeeded in breaking through the West Wall to the north, more than 15,600 men had been lost, and the end of February arrived before the struggle showed signs of ending. If eventually Montgomery's forces were to attack across the Rhine into the industrial region of the Ruhr, it would have to be on a narrow front. This enabled General Omar Bradley, whose interests were much the same as Patton's, to propose a backup position for the American forces. The First and Third Armies would advance to the Rhine before Montgomery made his attempt at a crossing. What Bradley was really doing was seeing to it that American troops were in a position to be first across the Rhine and first to spill out into the rest of Germany. During the assault on the River Sauer, the 4th Armoured Division of Patton's Third Army advanced on Bitburg, which they meant to use as a springboard for their own drive to the Rhine. By the 5th of March, the Allied assaults on the West Wall during the previous few days had opened the way for them. They left Bitburg, and 2 days later, on the 7th of March, the division's lead tanks reached the Rhine. The same morning, the US 9th Armoured Division of Hodge's First Army arrived at the Ludendorff railway bridge at Remagen, just as German engineers were preparing to blow it up. The Germans exploded some of their charges, but the bridge survived long enough for American infantry to cross the Rhine and establish the first Allied bridgehead on the other side. 10 days later, the bridge at Remagen collapsed into the river. Although much of the West Wall remained in German hands, it had failed in its prime purpose, to keep the Allies out of Germany. The Allied drive to the Rhine had effectively bypassed the fortifications and made them redundant once again. On the 20th of March, the 9th Armoured Division made a final assault on the West Wall. The Americans approached warily, expecting the pillboxes to explode with fire. There was none. The pillboxes were empty. Most of the defenders had gone. Some remained at their posts and surrendered. Others fled under cover of darkness. A few ransacked the ruins of houses for clothes, assumed civilian guise, and kept on running. Once the Allied forces were across the Rhine, it was only a matter of time before the Third Reich collapsed. This did not prevent the Germans from fighting on, and another 2 months passed after the crossing of the Rhine at Remagen before their surrender on the 7th of May 1945. By then, the West Wall had played its part in deciding the new shape of Europe and the nature of post-war politics, for the way in which it was finally overcome did not arise from purely military considerations. The Low Countries and northern Germany had come under Montgomery's overall command, so that taking this route to invade the Third Reich, as envisaged before D-Day, would have brought American forces under British control. However, the American generals were too chauvinistic to stand for that. This applied particularly to General Patton, whose name for Montgomery was unprintable, and to a lesser extent to General Bradley. To Patton, the idea that his hated rival might be the first to reach the Rhine was anathema. As for General Bradley, he had his own secret agenda in February 1945, when he suggested that Hodge's First Army and Patton's Third Army should mass at the Rhine to cover Montgomery's narrow front thrust across the river. This was important insurance against the Germans staging another Ardennes-style offensive. But it was no coincidence that it also made sure that the Rhine crossing would be an all-American enterprise. General Patton had made his own contribution to this state of affairs. By turning his aggressive defense at the West Wall into an aggressive offense, he drew the focus of American operations southwards. This was the wrong position for a speedy drive to Berlin, and meanwhile the Russians gained the time to move in from the east and reach the German capital first. Subsequently, this enabled them to claim for communism a larger share of Europe than the British and the Americans meant them to have. And for the next 45 years, until communism collapsed in Europe and the Cold War came to an end, the world had to live with the consequences.